On June 14, 1953, 12 days after the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, Group Captain Peter Townsend was summoned to the office of Sir Alan Lascelles. Lascelles was the Queen's private secretary. He was 65 years old. He had served the crown for 32 years across 4 monarchs. He had a reputation for cold precision in the way that men who spend decades inside an institution often do, and that morning he used it. He looked at Townsend and said, "You must be either mad or bad." Townsend records the meeting in his memoir, Time and Chance, published in 1978. He does not reproduce Lascelles's exact words at length. He does not describe the room in detail, or how he sat, or what he said in response. What he describes instead is the verdict. A group captain with a decorated war record, twice shot down, awarded the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, was being told by the man who ran the Queen's household that his feelings for Princess Margaret were not a private matter between 2 people. They were a problem, a constitutional problem. And the response to a constitutional problem in this particular institution was not sympathy, it was removal. He was posted to Brussels as air attaché 14 days after that conversation. The posting was announced quietly. There was no press conference, no palace statement. Townsend simply left and the palace moved on, and the coronation coverage dominated the newspapers, and for a moment, it seemed as though the management had worked. It had not worked. What Lascelles's intervention in June 1953 actually started was a pattern. Not a tidy pattern, not one the palace had designed in advance or would have chosen. A pattern that accumulated across 5 decades, across 4 different men, and that cost the crown something it never quite got back: the ability to control what people who loved Princess Margaret were willing to say about her. The men who came into her life between 1952 and 1981 are, taken together, a catalogue of the palace's methods. Each one was handled differently. Each one was given a different instrument of silence. Townsend was sent abroad. Robin Douglas Home had his letters sought after he died at 36 with a bottle of sleeping pills and a drawer full of debts. Antony Armstrong-Jones received a title, a career, and eventually a settlement. Roddy Llewellyn received no formal arrangement that anyone has identified, and he has maintained silence for more than 40 years, which is its own kind of statement. This is the story of those 4 men, what Margaret felt for each of them, what the palace did to each of them, and what each of them chose to do with what they knew. Before we go there, one thing needs to be said clearly. The word secret in the title is not sensationalism. Several of these relationships were secret for years before the press found them. One of them never became fully public until after both parties were dead. The word paid is used with deliberate precision. Not every payment was financial. Some came in the form of continued social inclusion, of decorations maintained, of careers not obstructed. But each of the men who moved through Margaret's inner circle between the early 1950s and the early 1980s was offered some form of the palace's usual currency, the currency that said, "We can make your life pleasant, or we can make it difficult, and what we ask in return is your discretion." Most of them took the offer. Some of them struggled with it. One of them did not survive it. That last detail is not dramatization. Robin Douglas Home died at 36 with no money, no prospects, and a collection of letters from a princess he had loved but could not talk about. Whether his death was connected to the pressure he was under is something we will come back to. What is documented is the sequence of events, and the sequence is enough. But before we can understand any of these men, we need to understand what they were walking into when they walked into Margaret's world. And that requires going back to a house in Scotland and a 6-year-old girl who had just been told that everything was about to change. The house was Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland. The year was 1936, and what changed that August was not small. Margaret Rose was born at Glamis on August 21, 1930. Her parents were the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father was Albert Frederick Arthur George, the second son of King George V, a quiet man with a stammer he had spent years training himself to manage. Her mother was Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, a woman whose social gifts were famous even then, and whose management of her own image would become one of the more remarkable performances of the 20th century. The older sister was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, born in April 1926 in London. She was 4 years ahead, which in a childhood is a different generation's worth of experience. By 1930, Elizabeth was already the one who understood, with a 4-year-old's clarity, what it meant to be the heir. Margaret did not have that clarity to begin with. She had something else instead. She had the run of the house. The biographies agree on this. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling, published in 2017, which is both the most thorough and the most honest portrait of her life, describes a child who was quick, musically gifted, and aware of herself in a way her parents found both delightful and sometimes difficult. She could sing before she could reliably read. She did impressions of people she had just met, caught something true about them, and delivered it with a timing that made adults stop and pay attention. She understood which gap to find between what a person said and what they meant, and she found it every time. She was also the second, the spare, the one around whom the future was not arranged. For 6 years this was fine. The family lived in a comfortable, almost private way for people of their rank. The main residence was 145 Piccadilly, which was an agreeable Regency townhouse rather than a palace. There were country weekends at the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, which her father was slowly renovating. There were summers at Birkhall and visits to Glamis. There were dogs, and parents who were actually present in a way that royal parents in that era were not always able to be. Then in December 1936, Edward VIE abdicated, and everything the family had arranged itself around, the privacy, the relative calm, the Piccadilly house, the sense that the succession was someone else's problem, all of it was gone in 48 hours. Her father became King George VI. Her mother became Queen. Elizabeth became heir, and Margaret became the sister of the heir, which is a very specific position, one with enormous privileges and no formal purpose, and one that the family had no real template for managing. She was 6 years old. Tim Heald, in his biography Princess Margaret, A Life Unravelled, published in 2007, describes the effect of the abdication on Margaret's childhood in terms of what it removed, rather than what it gave. It removed the ordinary domestic arrangements that had made the family feel stable. It removed the father who had been genuinely available, and replaced him with a king who now had to be publicly managed, as well as privately loved. It removed the sense that the two girls were roughly equivalent participants in the same childhood. After December 1936, Elizabeth was being prepared for a future that had a shape. Margaret's future had no shape at all. What she did with that shapelessness was characteristic. She turned it into performance. The impressions got better, the singing got more serious. Marion Crawford, the governess who later wrote The Little Princesses, the 1950 memoir that made her a pariah at court for the rest of her life, describes a child who could hold a room with an anecdote and who understood the power of an audience before she understood very much else. The awareness was not vanity, not simply. It was survival. When the shape of your future is unclear, you lean on what you can do in the present, and what Margaret could do in the present was make people pay attention to her. The war came when she was 9. They spent most of it at Windsor, which was not the cheerful wartime that the official photographs suggested. The castle was cold, and the rotas of public appearances that her sister was beginning to take on were not yet her responsibility. By the time the war ended in 1945, Elizabeth was 19, and being fitted into the public apparatus of an heir. Margaret was 14, which is not an age at which anyone finds their position clear. What she did have, by 1945, was a father she was genuinely close to, and a social life that was beginning to take shape. The parties at Windsor and at Balmoral had started to include young men. She was quick and funny and beautiful, and the young men paid attention. Several of them fell for her. None of them, at this point, had the complications that would define the men she chose in her 30s and 40s. Then in February 1952, her father died. George VI had been ill since 1949. A cancerous lung had been removed in September 1951. He was 56 years old. He had smoked steadily since his 20s, partly, some accounts suggest, because it helped him manage the stammer that had shadowed his entire public life. On the morning of February 6, 1952, his valet found him dead in his bedroom at Sandringham. He had died in his sleep during the night. Margaret was 21. She had been expecting this. The illness had been serious enough that the prognosis had been, by late 1951, essentially a question of time. but expecting a death and receiving it are different things. And what she received on that February morning was the simultaneous arrival of grief and the knowledge that her own position had just changed again. Elizabeth was now queen. The whole machinery of succession had moved. Margaret was now the queen's sister, which was a distinct position from being the heir's sister, and the distinction mattered in ways that would take years to become fully clear. She was no longer second in the line of succession. She was a private person, more or less, with a civil list allowance and a set of apartments in Kensington Palace, and a role that nobody had written a job description for. What she had in February 1952, apart from grief, was Peter Townsend. He had been her father's equerry since 1944, which meant he had been part of the household for 8 years. He was known to both girls as a fixture of the household, a tall, composed RAF officer who moved through the palace with the particular calm of someone who had been trained to perform under pressure. He was 37, she was 21. During the period of the king's illness, he had been present for many of the private family moments that illness creates. The morning updates, the quiet sitting rooms, the conversations between people who are managing the same fear. Townsend writes in Time and Chance that he and Margaret did not fall in love in a single moment. He describes something slower than that, an accumulation of time and proximity and recognition across the months following the king's death. He describes it with care, as a man who knew, by the time he was writing, that the account would be read against everything that had happened since. What Anne Glenconner, who was a close friend of Margaret from the 1950s onward, makes clear in Lady-in-Waiting, her 2019 memoir, is that the feeling was visible to people around them before anyone said anything. Glenconner describes a Margaret in 1952 and 1953 who was, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely occupied. Not performing, not managing a room, occupied. The occupation had a name, but the name was not being used aloud. Then the coronation happened, and then a photograph was taken, and then Lascelles made his call. The photograph is famous now. Most people who know anything about this story know what it shows. Princess Margaret, on the steps of Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953, leaning toward Peter Townsend and brushing what appeared to be a piece of lint from the lapel of his RAF uniform. The gesture was small. The intimacy of it was not. Courtiers noticed it. Press photographers captured it. Within the week, the foreign press had begun to run stories. The Daily Mirror and The People ran them on June 14th, the same day Lascelles had his conversation with Townsend. The timing was not coincidental. The decision to post Townsend to Brussels had been made before the press ran the stories, not because of them. The palace was not reacting to coverage, it was acting in anticipation of it. Lascelles's memo to the cabinet, which has since become part of the historical record, outlined the constitutional position with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking about it. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, no member of the royal family could marry without the sovereign's consent before the age of 25, and after 25 the family member could only proceed if Parliament did not object. The act had been passed after George III found himself unable to control his children's marriages, and it had remained in force since then with occasional modification. Margaret was 22. She needed the Queen's consent, and the Queen, whatever her private feelings, was being advised by Lascelles that granting consent would create a constitutional crisis, a Church of England crisis, and a Commonwealth crisis, simultaneously. Townsend was a divorced man. The Church of England, whose head was the sovereign, did not recognize divorce. The Archbishop of Canterbury was Geoffrey Fisher, who held this position with all the authority of someone who had never once been tempted to violate it. And the Commonwealth, whose leaders had just watched the coronation of their new head with the kind of attention that made any subsequent scandal land harder, was not, in Lascelles's reading, prepared for the spectacle of the new Queen's sister marrying her divorced equerry. Townsend left for Brussels on June 29, 1953. He was posted as heir attaché to the British Embassy. The role was real, but the posting was management. He knew it. He later said he knew it at the time. What he received in exchange, or what was extended to him in lieu of explanation, was the continued respect of his rank, his decorations, and his status as a gentleman. Nobody called him a predator in official communications. Nobody cut him from the invitation lists he was on, the club memberships, the professional courtesies. He was simply moved. The machinery of social management in this milieu does not, as a rule, destroy people openly. It relocates them, quietly enough that no single action looks like punishment. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now before we go further. What we are about to cover on the remaining 3 men in Margaret's circle, and what the palace arranged for each of them, is the part of this story that has been assembled from multiple sources, but never put together in a single account. Hit subscribe and the bell. Everything from this point forward is the part most people have never seen in full. The 2 years of Townsend's exile in Brussels are sometimes described as a waiting period, 2 people counting the days until October 1955, when Margaret turned 25, and the Royal Marriages Act's consent requirement technically expired for her, meaning she could marry without the sovereign's approval if she gave Parliament notice. This framing underestimates what those 2 years actually were. Townsend was in Brussels, Margaret was in London. They wrote to each other, though the full correspondence has never been published and remains in private hands. What Glenconner records in Lady-in-Waiting is not the content of the letters, but the mood they created in Margaret during this period. She was not patient, she was not serene about the arrangement. She was, in Glenconner's description, someone doing the work of a public life while waiting for a private one, attending the engagements, wearing the appropriate expression, delivering the appropriate sentences, and counting. In October 1955, Townsend was permitted to return to Britain. He came back on October 12, a Wednesday. He and Margaret spent the following 16 days seeing each other at various private locations, among them Clarence House and the home of Major John Wills in Berkshire, whose house at Allenbay Park provided a place away from press surveillance. During those 16 days they had a conversation the content of which neither ever fully disclosed, and from which Margaret emerged with a decision. On October 31, 1955, she issued a statement through the Press Association. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage, but, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." The statement is 27 seconds long to read aloud. It contains the word "I" twice. It contains the word "mindful." It was broadcast on the BBC's 9 o'clock news that evening, and reprinted in every national newspaper the following morning. And it ended, in a single paragraph, the most publicly discussed romance in Britain since the abdication. What most accounts of this moment get wrong is the emphasis. They frame it as a sacrifice, as Margaret giving up the love of her life for duty. That framing is not inaccurate, exactly, but it is incomplete, because what the statement also ended was the palace's need to manage Peter Townsend. Once she issued it, he was no longer a problem. He was a man who could be allowed to exist comfortably, to write his memoir, to give his interviews, to live well in France, because nothing he said would change anything that had already been decided. The management worked. He went back to Brussels. In 1959, he married Marie-Luce Germagne, a 19-year-old Belgian woman who bore, as several observers noted at the time, a resemblance to the princess he had not been permitted to keep. He wrote Time and Chance in 1978, 23 years after the statement, and it is a scrupulous and careful book, protective of everyone named in it. He described Margaret as the most wonderful woman I have ever known in the 1978 interviews that accompanied the book's publication, and the description, offered at that distance, was allowed to stand as the kind of statement nobody needed to suppress. He died on June 19, 1995, in his house in the Normandy village of Le Moulin de la Tuileries. He was 80 years old. Margaret was still alive. She outlived the relationship by 40 years, and the man who had made it by 7. She had 3 more men to go through first. To understand why the palace needed to manage Margaret's relationships at all, you have to understand what kind of woman she was by her early 20s. Because the men who came into her life did not fall into a void. They fell into something specific, and the specificity matters. By 1952, the year her father died and Peter Townsend became the dominant fact of her emotional life, Margaret was 21 years old and already understood to be a problem in the particular way that brilliant women, with no official purpose, were problems in post-war Britain. She was not going to be the Queen. She was not going to be Prime Minister. She was not going to run a company, because women of her class and position did not run companies in 1952. She was going to be a princess, and a princess's function in the 1950s was to appear at the right events, marry the right person, and decline to have opinions about anything that mattered. Margaret had opinions about everything. She had opinions about music, particularly jazz and musical theatre, and they were educated opinions. She played piano to a standard that professional musicians found genuinely good. She knew the American songbook with the kind of precision that comes from actually listening. Noel Coward, who was her friend from the time she was a teenager and who was not in the habit of flattering people to their faces when he didn't mean it, told her in a letter in 1955 that her voice was effortlessly accurate in a way that most people who study singing for 10 years never achieve. Coward wrote this privately. He did not perform compliments for people who did not deserve them. She had opinions about painting, about literature, about film. She read broadly, and she retained what she read. The people who were brought to dinner at Windsor or Clarence House to provide intellectual stimulus for the royal family during the 1950s found that the younger sister was the one who had already read the book, already seen the film, already had a position she was prepared to defend across the table. And she had opinions about men. She had always had opinions about men. Marion Crawford, in The Little Princesses, describes a teenage Margaret who assessed the young men who came to Windsor with a clarity that was sometimes uncomfortable for the young men being assessed. She was not cruel about it. She was accurate, which was worse. The official royal family, as a system, is not designed for women with accurate opinions. It is designed for women who can channel what they know into the appropriate performance at the appropriate moment and otherwise maintain a composed silence. Queen Elizabeth II mastered this requirement so completely that 60 years of biographers have struggled to find the person underneath it. Margaret never mastered it, and never wanted to. The person she was leaked continuously, in the way that people who refuse to perform themselves tend to leak. What she wanted, and what the biographies and memoirs of people who knew her well make consistently clear, was a life she had chosen. Not the Kensington Palace apartment the Queen's household had arranged, not the civil list allowance that came with it, not the schedule of public engagements that arrived with her name pre-printed on them. She wanted, with a specificity that she sometimes expressed in private and sometimes expressed in ways that were reported in the newspapers, the same thing any intelligent 22-year-old with strong preferences and a lot of energy wants: a life organized around what she actually cared about, with a person she had actually chosen to be with. The structure of her position made this almost impossible, but it did not make Peter Townsend impossible, and that, more than anything, is why he became the central figure of her emotional life for the early part of the 1950s. There is something else about the period before Townsend that gets underweighted in most accounts of her life: her relationship with her sister. Elizabeth and Margaret were close in the way sisters who share an unusual world are close, with a closeness that contains, inevitably, a good deal of unspoken comparison. Elizabeth was the one the country had organized itself around. Elizabeth was the one the newspapers wrote about when they wrote about the future. Elizabeth was the one who, when she appeared in public, carried with her the whole weight of institutional expectation. Margaret was the one who, when she appeared in public, got the second paragraph. This was not Elizabeth's fault. It was not a dynamic either of them had chosen, but it was real, and it was persistent, and it shaped the choices Margaret made in ways that nobody fully mapped at the time. The biographies that came later, Craig Brown's particularly, are careful about this because the easy reading of Margaret's life, the reading that frames her as the thwarted beauty in her sister's shadow, is not quite right and not quite wrong, and the truth of it is more complicated than either version. What is documented is the following. When Elizabeth became queen in February 1952, the new queen's primary concern was the functioning of her role. She was 25 years old, and she had just inherited, overnight, the full administrative and ceremonial weight of the British monarchy. She had a husband who had strong opinions about how a household should be run, and 2 young children, and a mother who was now, technically, the Queen Mother, and a sister who was in love with the divorced equerry. The Queen dealt with the Townsend situation the way she dealt with most complicated human situations in this period. She referred it to the men whose job was to manage such things. Lascelles was the man. The church was the institution. The memo was the instrument. And the memo said, no. Margaret heard the verdict through intermediaries. That detail matters. She was not called into a room and told by her sister directly. She heard it through the apparatus, which means she understood, from this early point, that when the family had something difficult to communicate to her, it would arrive through channels rather than across a table. That understanding shaped every subsequent interaction she had with the palace on the subject of her personal life. She did not go to the Queen. She did not appeal to the Queen. She made her own decision in October 1955, issued her own statement, and received the result. The result was loneliness. The specific loneliness of a woman who had spent 3 years loving someone she was not permitted to keep, in an institution where the official response to that kind of grief was a staff member with a composed expression and an appropriate sentence about duty. The men who came after Townsend were, in some ways, responses to that loneliness. Not in a reductive, psychological sense, as though she was simply seeking replacement. She was not that simple. But each of the subsequent relationships has, in it, something of the shape of a person who has learned that the standard arrangements on offer, the appropriate marriage, the suitable husband, the managed life, are things she cannot make herself want, and is therefore looking for something outside the standard arrangement. The years between October 1955 and May 1960 are not empty in her record. They are full. She travelled. She attended an extraordinary number of parties, in London and in the country and abroad. She was photographed at nightclubs, at the theatre, at private houses in the country. She was the most photographed woman in Britain for much of this period, which is remarkable given that she held no official role beyond princess. She came very close to marrying Billy Wallace in 1956. Wallace was a friend, an heir to substantial money, and someone who had been in her social circle for years. She may have accepted a proposal from him, or something close to it, in early 1956. Then Wallace went on holiday and slept with someone else, and told her about it, and Margaret ended whatever arrangement they had reached, with an abruptness that friends of both parties later described as total. He said she was done with him the morning after he told her, and she was. There were others she allowed close before keeping a distance. John Turner, Mark Bonham Carter, fleetingly. The biographies name several men in this period, and what they have in common is that the connections were never formalized and never sustained past the point where they might have required a decision. She was waiting for someone who did not fit the approved category. She was 30, and she was running out of time in the way women in her position in 1960 understood they were running out of time, when a man she had barely registered in her social circle sent her a note inviting her to dinner, and everything changed. The man was Antony Armstrong-Jones. The dinner was in February 1958, at the house of Lady Elizabeth Cavendish in Chain Walk, Chelsea. He was 27. She was 27. They had met before, briefly, at a party the previous year. Neither appears to have made much impression on the other at first meeting. At the Cheyne Walk dinner they talked until long after the other guests had gone. There is a version of the Armstrong-Jones story that is tidy. Boy meets girl. They are both unconventional, both creative, both drawn to the same world of art and music and bohemian London. They marry. The marriage is brilliant on the surface and privately combustible, and after 18 years it ends in the first royal divorce since Henry VI's. The tidy version of the story treats the marriage as a misadventure, a choice that could not have worked for anyone. The truth is not tidy. Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones was born on March 7, 1930, in Kensington. His father, Ronald Armstrong-Jones, was a barrister who eventually became a King's Counsel. His mother was Anne Messel, the daughter of Leonard Messel, whose country house at Nymans in Sussex had one of the great garden collections in Britain. His mother later married Michael Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross, which gave Tony a half-brother in the Parsons family and a connection, through his stepfather, to the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. His parents divorced when he was 5. He was sent to Sandroyd School in Wiltshire and then to Eton. At Eton, he had a bout of polio that left him with a weakened right leg and which required him to wear a built-up shoe for part of his life. He was not, by his account, or by the accounts of people who knew him at school, particularly interested in conventional success. He was interested in making things. He rode at Cambridge, at Jesus College, where he had gone to read natural sciences but left without completing his degree, and after Cambridge, he had a brief period of uncertainty before deciding, with a confidence that turned out to be justified, that he would be a photographer. By the late 1950s, he was one of the best photographers working in London. His portraits for Vogue and for the Society Press had a quality that the field's practitioners recognized, and that the subjects themselves often found uncomfortable. He did not flatter. He found something true about a face and put it on the page. The portfolio from this period, theatrical portraits particularly, has a precision that was not common in British commercial photography at the time. What is also clear about this period of his life, and what the biographies that have followed him have treated with varying degrees of candor, is that his social world contained a significant number of gay men, and that his relationship to that world was not simply proximity. Jeremy Fry, who was announced as his best man when the engagement to Princess Margaret became public in February 1960, was withdrawn before the wedding with the explanation that he had a medical condition that prevented his attendance. The actual reason, which emerged later, was that Fry had a 1952 conviction for a homosexual offense. The withdrawal was handled quickly and without public elaboration. Fry and Armstrong-Jones remained close friends. Nicholas Haslam, the designer, described his own friendship with Armstrong-Jones in terms that acknowledged the social world they shared. Craig Brown's research for Ma'am Darling, which is based on an exceptionally wide range of interviews and documents, is careful about this subject, but does not elide it. The picture that emerges is of a man whose emotional and erotic life did not fit comfortably into the available categories, and who had found, in the London art and theatre world of the late 1950s, a circle where the categories were loose enough to accommodate him. What Princess Margaret offered him, when their connection deepened after February 1958, was not a retreat from that world. She was part of it. She was the most famous person in it, but she was genuinely of it, someone whose interest in theatre and photography and design was real rather than patronizing. She was also, and this is not a small thing, someone who understood the performance requirements of public life at a level that most of the people around him did not, and who shared his preference for a private self that did not match the public one. The courtship was conducted in serious secrecy for 2 years. He had a studio at 59 Rotherhithe Street, a converted warehouse on the south bank of the Thames, which could be reached by water and which the press, for most of this period, did not know existed. Margaret visited it. The secrecy required a level of logistical effort that, had it become public at the time, would have been a story in itself. The engagement was announced on February 26, 1960. The press had not anticipated it. The wedding was set for May 6 at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding to be televised, and an estimated 300 million people watched it. The marriage worked, in its fashion, for about 8 years. What that means, in the context of two highly intelligent, highly competitive people who both needed to be the dominant presence in a room, is that it worked at the level of shared life, shared interests, shared social world. They built something real together, the way Kensington Palace 1A was decorated, the people they had to dinner, the holidays in Mustique where Margaret's friend Colin Tennant had established a private retreat on a Caribbean island that had not yet been discovered by mass tourism. Their children, David and Sarah, were born in 1961 and 1964. The photographs from this period, taken by people other than Armstrong-Jones, because he rarely photographed his own family, show two people who were often in the same room, often watching each other, sometimes with pleasure and sometimes with something sharper. From about 1967 onward, it was sharper more often than not. The cruelty in the marriage has been documented by multiple sources. Armstrong-Jones, by various accounts, composed written insults he stored in a drawer and retrieved when he wanted to wound his wife at a specific point. One account, repeated in several biographies, has him leaving notes around the apartment, containing sentences designed to destroy her on particular days. Glenconner describes witnessing exchanges between them that she records as wounding in a way that was different from ordinary marital argument, calculated rather than reactive, as though both of them were operating from a list of each other's vulnerabilities they had spent years compiling. The affairs on both sides were known within the circle before they were known outside it. Armstrong-Jones had his own life alongside the marriage for much of the 1970s, the most significant long-term relationship being with Lucy Lindsay-Hogg, an Irish actress and former wife of the film director Michael Lindsay-Hogg, whom he eventually married in 1997, after the divorce from Margaret had been final for nearly 20 years. Margaret had hers. Robin Douglas Home, in 1967. Roddy Llewellyn from 1973. The formal separation came on March 19, 1976. The divorce was finalized on May 24, 1978. It was, as the headlines noted at the time, the first divorce in the senior royal family since the 16th century. The financial settlement has never been fully disclosed. What is publicly recorded is that Armstrong-Jones retained his title, the Earldom of Snowdon, which the Queen had created for him in 1961, and which was his to keep regardless of the marriage's fate. He retained his MBE, his GC-VO, and the various other decorations he had accumulated. He retained his career, which had never been dependent on the marriage for its substance, but which benefited from continued access to a social world in which royal connections were a professional asset. He retained the apartment the couple had used in Kensington Palace until a mutually agreed point after the separation. What the palace arranged, in practical terms, was the management of a man who knew a great deal about a member of the royal family and who had the profile, the wit, and the professional standing to make that knowledge extremely public if he chose to. He did not choose to. The memoir he did not write has been noted by several journalists over the years, and when asked about it in interviews, he gave answers that were consistent with someone who had made a private calculation about what was worth saying and what was worth keeping. He died on January 13, 2017, aged 86. In his last years, it became known that he had fathered a daughter with Melanie Cable Alexander, born in 1998, a relationship and a child that had been kept from the public for nearly 20 years. The revelation, which came after his death through documentary confirmation, added a layer to the picture of a man whose private life had always been more complicated than the official version suggested. The palace's management of Armstrong-Jones was different in character from its management of Townsend, because the circumstances were different. Townsend was removed before the relationship formalized. Armstrong-Jones was already the husband when the management became necessary, which meant the instruments available were different. He could not be exiled to Brussels. He could be given a title and a career and a separation agreement, and the understanding that the alternative to a well-managed divorce was a badly managed one, and that a badly managed divorce involving the Queen's sister would be worse for him than for the institution. He understood the calculation. He had been making calculations of that kind his entire professional life. The photographs he chose to publish, and the ones he chose not to, had always been an exercise in understanding what power a given image contained and what the consequences of releasing it would be. He chose, in the end, to keep most of what he knew. There is one more thing about the Armstrong-Jones marriage that the official record does not fully contain, and that several people who were present during the marriage have described in various forms since. During the marriage, while Tony had his long-term involvement with Lucy Lindsay-Hogg, and while Margaret's friendships with various men in her circle were in various stages of seriousness, there was a man named Robin Douglas Home. He was not, by most measures, the most significant man in Margaret's life. He was not Townsend, who was the great passion of her 20s. He was not Armstrong-Jones, who was the father of her children and the husband of 18 years. He was not Roddy Llewellyn, who was the last person she loved in the way she understood love. He was, instead, the man who died for it. Robin Archibald Douglas Home was born on September 1, 1932. He was the son of Henry Montague Douglas Home and Margaret Ogilvy, and the nephew, on his father's side, of Alexander Frederick Douglas Home, who would become Prime Minister in October 1963, and who is remembered now, if he is remembered at all, as the 14th Earl of Home, and as the last Prime Minister to serve in the House of Lords, before taking a disclaimed peerage to lead the country from the Commons. Robin Douglas Home did not have his uncle's political aptitude or his uncle's comfort with institutional life. What he had was a musical gift, a social fluency that came naturally rather than strategically, and a capacity for spending money he did not possess on a scale that accumulated debts faster than his income could address them. By the time he came into Margaret's orbit in 1967, he owed approximately £36,000, which in 1967 was a serious sum. He had been married once, to Sandra Paul, who later married Michael Howard, the Conservative politician, and who has maintained for decades a dignified silence about the Douglas home years. They divorced in 1962. By 1967, he was living in London, playing piano at private events, writing occasional journalism, and circulating in the society that Margaret moved through. He had been around the edges of her world for some years before 1967. The friendship became something else during 1967, when the Armstrong-Jones marriage had settled into its Cold War phase, and Margaret was spending an increasing amount of time in the company of people who were not her husband. The love letters that came from this period are, by the accounts of the few people who have seen them, or been told their content by those who have, among the most unguarded documents Margaret ever produced. She was 37 years old. She was writing to a man she trusted, with something that was, in the context of her position, an extraordinary act of private expression. She wrote about what her life felt like from the inside. She wrote about the protocol, and the pressure, and the permanent sense of being managed. She wrote, in at least one passage that has been described by people with knowledge of the letters, about feeling as though her actual self existed somewhere the institution could not reach, and that Robin was the person she could send it to. These letters were hers, in the sense that she wrote them. They were also, in another sense, the property of a woman whose correspondence was understood by everyone in her circle to carry constitutional weight, meaning that what she put in writing was never entirely private, because the institution she was part of did not make full provision for private. In 1967 or early 1968, Robin Douglas Home approached Neue Review, a German illustrated magazine, with an offer. He had material, he said, that would be of interest. He was understood to be offering either the letters themselves or information derived from them. The exact nature of the approach has been described differently by different sources over the years. What is consistent across the accounts is that the British establishment learned of it, and that the learning of it had consequences. Whether the palace's response to Douglas Home's approach contributed to the final state he was in when he died on October 15, 1968, is something no inquest and no subsequent investigation has definitively established. What is established is the sequence: the approach to Neue Review, the establishment response, the continued deterioration of his finances, the debts at £36,000, the flat in Berkshire, the bottle of sleeping pills, the open verdict at the inquest. He was 36 years old. There was no formal relationship to manage afterward, because the relationship had never been public. There was no wife to whom arrangements needed to be explained, because he was unmarried when he died. There were the letters, and the letters required attention. The management of those letters after Douglas Home's death has never been fully documented. What is known is that some material was acquired by parties with an interest in its suppression, and that some material survived in private hands and has been referenced by researchers and journalists without being published in full. The nature of the Royal Archive, which is administered at Windsor Castle, and which controls access to a significant portion of the historical record of the 20th century monarchy, means that documents touching on matters of this kind can be effectively restricted from public view for periods long enough to outlast the people most directly concerned. Craig Brown was given access to more material on Margaret's life than most writers have been, in preparation for Ma'am Darling, and his account is the most careful and complete available. He does not publish the letters. He does not claim to have read them. He describes their existence and their general character from secondary sources, which is itself a careful navigational choice of the kind that writers working on royal subjects learn to make. What remains is not the letters but the shape they leave. A woman who was, by all accounts of people who knew her in the late 1960s, in genuine distress about the state of her marriage and her life, found someone she could write to without the performance. The performance was what the institution required. The letters were the alternative to it. And when the alternative was threatened, the institution moved, as it always moved, to contain the exposure. There is one more dimension to this story that has been largely absent from the accounts written in Douglas Home's lifetime, and for some years after: the piano playing. He was described by people who heard him as genuinely talented. Not professional concert level, but better than good in the way that people who have spent years making music seriously are better than good. He played jazz and he played popular songs, and he played classical pieces by Chopin and Satie with the touch of someone who had been playing since childhood. It is a small detail, but it matters because it is part of what Margaret recognized in him. She was a serious pianist herself. The musical conversations they could have were real conversations, not the performances that social conversation about art so often becomes. When she described the relationship to Anne Glenconner, as Glenconner records in Lady in Waiting, she described it in terms of connection rather than passion. He understood what she was actually saying. He could hear what she was actually playing. He wrote back, "The cruelty of what happened to him is not the palace's cruelty exactly, because the palace did not tell him to accumulate £36,000 in debts, and the palace did not tell him to approach a German magazine. The cruelty is the structure of a world in which a person could love a princess genuinely and find themselves, at 36, in a room alone, with an outcome that felt like the only available exit. That structural cruelty is what the palace, over the 50 years that followed, has never fully accounted for. The accounting for it was left to the people who knew him. They are mostly dead now too." In August 1973, Colin Tennant held a house party at Glen, his family estate in Peeblesshire, in the Scottish borders. Tennant was the third Baron Glenconner, one of Margaret's oldest and closest friends, and the owner of the island of Mustique in the Caribbean, where he had been building villas and inviting the people he found interesting since the late 1950s. He had given Margaret a plot of land on Mustique as a wedding present in 1960, and by 1973 she had a villa there, Les Jolies Eaux, where she went for several weeks each year and where the press, in that pre-satellite era, could not easily follow. The Glen House Party in August 1973 brought together a collection of Tennant's friends that included several people in their 20s and 30s, whose connection to the aristocracy was more social than ancestral. One of them was Roderick Victor Llewellyn, 25 years old, the son of Sir Harry Llewellyn, the Olympic show jumper who had won gold at the 1952 Helsinki Games on his horse Fox Hunter, and who was one of the most celebrated sporting figures in post-war Wales. Roddy Llewellyn, by 1973, had not yet found what he was for. He had a good family, a good education at Shrewsbury, and an interest in gardens that had not yet crystallized into a profession. He was pleasant and gentle and possessed, by the accounts of everyone who knew him at the time, of the kind of manner that makes people feel attended to. He was not, in any conventional sense, a man who would have attracted attention in that particular company on his own merits. He was pretty, and he was kind, and he was 25 years old, and he was almost nothing like Peter Townsend, which may be part of what Margaret found when she looked at him across a room in Peeblesshire that August. She was 43. He was 25. The 17-year gap was real, and was noticed, and was not, for either of them in that first meeting, what either of them was primarily focused on. Glenconner describes the beginning of the friendship with a care that protects both parties without being evasive about what it was. He had an ease about him that the men in Margaret's life since Townsend had largely not had. Townsend had ease of a military kind, the composed calm of someone trained to function under pressure. Armstrong-Jones had a different kind of ease, the controlled assurance of a man who understood how he appeared in a room and managed the appearance. Roddy Llewellyn had something older than either, an unstudied goodness that is rarer than either composure or assurance, and that is almost impossible to fake. Margaret recognized it. She had been surrounded, for the better part of 20 years, by people who were performing in one way or another. The court performs. The husband was a photographer, which meant his relationship to appearance was professional and constant. The ladies in waiting performed their roles with varying degrees of comfort, but performed them nonetheless. Roddy Llewellyn, in a Scottish house in August 1973, was simply someone who was glad to be where he was, and who found her funny. She found this startling. She found it, if the accounts of people around her during this period are to be credited, something close to restorative. The relationship that developed between 1973 and 1976 was conducted on Mustique, in London private houses, and at various country locations, with the assistance of the same network of friends who had been helping Margaret arrange private time for the previous 20 years. Glenconner was the primary facilitator because Mustique was his island and the villa was his arrangement, and the people he invited there could be trusted, in the way that people who have been inside an aristocratic network for decades are trusted, to keep what they saw to themselves. What made Mustique work as a location was not simply its remoteness. It was a private island owned by a private individual who controlled who came and went. The British press in 1973 and 1974 and 1975 could not land a correspondent at Mustique without Tennant's agreement, and Tennant did not agree. The Villa Les Jolies Eaux, which means pretty waters, was set on a hillside above a beach called Jelly Saut, and the beach was not accessible from the village. It was, in practical terms, as close to invisible as a royal residence could be. This worked until February 1976, when it stopped working. The Sunday People is a British tabloid newspaper. On February 22, 1976, it published a photograph on its front page. The photograph showed Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn on the beach at Mustique. They were in swimwear. They were not touching, but they were together, and the context of the photograph and the caption made clear that they were together in a way that was not coincidental. The photograph had been taken by a reporter who had arrived at Mustique by boat without Tennant's knowledge or permission. The paper ran the story that accompanied the photograph with a headline that has been described variously in accounts since, but whose essential content was the identification of the relationship and the identification of Llewellyn, including his age, which at 28 was 15 years younger than Margaret at 45. The response was immediate. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by every major newspaper in Britain and by international press across Europe and North America. The specific character of the story, a separated princess, the Snowdon separation, had been announced publicly in March 1976, a month after the photograph. We will come back to this timing. In an apparent romantic relationship with a man 17 years her junior, was exactly the material the British tabloid press of the mid-1970s was structured to amplify. Armstrong-Jones was in Nepal when the photograph appeared, working on a photographic project. He made a brief statement. The palace made a brief statement. Neither statement was illuminating, which is exactly what brief palace statements are designed not to be. Willie Hamilton, the Labour MP for Fife Central, who had been the most consistent parliamentary critic of the civil list for years, made a statement that was rather more illuminating. He called for Margaret's civil list allocation, which was £55,000 per year, to be reviewed in light of what the photograph suggested about how it was being spent. Hamilton's criticism found an audience beyond his usual one. The photograph had arrived at a politically sensitive moment, when public patience with the cost of the monarchy was genuinely lower than it had been, and Hamilton understood how to work that moment. The formal separation from Armstrong-Jones was announced in mid-March 1976, 3 weeks after the photograph. The timing has attracted comment from biographers and journalists ever since, because the question of which came first, the decision to separate or the photograph that made a continued fiction of the marriage impossible, has never been definitively answered. What is clear is that the two events, the photograph on February 22 and the separation announcement in March, arrived in rapid succession, and that the photograph accelerated at minimum the timing of the announcement. Roddy Llewellyn's response to the exposure was characteristic of everything that was said about his character by the people who knew him. He did not sell a story, he did not give a press conference, he did not attempt to leverage what he knew into anything. He went through a period of considerable personal difficulty in the years immediately following 1976, spending time at a place called Surrendell Farm in Wiltshire, a small holding run by a group of people attempting, with varying success, the kind of communal rural life that attracted certain people in mid-1970s Britain. He was not happy at Surrendell Farm. He was not suited to it. He left. What he found, in the late 1970s, was gardens. He trained at the Chelsea Physic Garden, the 4-acre botanical garden on the embankment that has been teaching horticulture in one form or another since 1673. He became a landscape garden designer, and he became a good one, building a practice that in the 1980s and 1990s was genuinely successful in the commercial world of private garden design. He married Tatiana Soskin on July 9, 1981, a few months after his relationship with Margaret had come to its natural end. They had 2 daughters. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in his professional and personal life after 1981, happy in a way that was accessible and calm, and not contingent on anything the palace or the press could give or take away. He attended Margaret's funeral at Windsor Castle on February 15, 2002. He was photographed arriving. He made no statement to the press. In the years between 1976 and 2002, he gave a handful of interviews about the relationship, always measured, always warm, never exploitative. He described her as someone he loved and whose company was genuinely one of the great pleasures of his life. He said she had the best laugh of anyone he had ever met. He said the gap in their ages had never been something either of them focused on, except when other people raised it. He is in his late 70s now, living in England, still practicing as a garden designer in some form. He has not written a memoir, he has not sold his archive, he has not spoken at length about the relationship for many years. Whether this sustained silence reflects a private calculation, a continuing affection for Margaret's memory, a natural preference for a life outside the spotlight, or some combination of all three, is not something anyone outside his household can say with certainty. What it is not is the palace's doing, at least not in any documented way. The silence of Roddy Llewellyn is the one in this catalogue that does not appear to have a financial or institutional arrangement behind it. He simply chose to be quiet. In a story full of people who were paid or pressured or managed into discretion, he appears to be the one who arrived at it himself. That distinction matters, but it also makes him, in a way, the hardest of the four men to write about with confidence. The others left documents, Townsend's memoir, the letters Douglas Home tried to sell, the court records and financial agreements of the Snowdon divorce. Llewellyn left only his behavior, which has been consistent across 4 decades, and which says, in every interview and in every silence, that whatever passed between him and Margaret in those 8 years was something he considers sacred enough not to reduce to print. The palace, watching this from Buckingham Palace and from wherever the mechanisms that monitor such things are housed, must have found it satisfying. What makes the Townsend story strange, at this distance, is how slowly it moved. The moment people remember the October 31 statement and the walk across the wet grass at Allen Bay Park that Townsend describes in his memoir arrived at the end of a process that had been running for 3 years and that involved, by the time it concluded, the cabinet, the church, the Commonwealth, and the private emotional life of 2 people who were never given a room to themselves without someone taking notes. Begin with what Townsend actually was when all of this started. He was appointed equerry to King George VI in 1944. The role of equerry, in this context, meant that he was a personal attendant to the king, responsible for organizing the king's official engagements, accompanying the royal family on public duties, and managing the logistics of a working household. It was not a clerical position. It required the combination of social fluency, physical competence, and absolute discretion that the military produced in certain officers, and Townsend had all 3. He had earned them under pressure. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, he had flown with 43 Squadron and then with 85 Squadron, the latter under the command of Peter Townsend himself after his promotion to squadron leader. He had shot down at least 5 enemy aircraft, which qualified him as an ace under the RAF's criteria of the period. He had been shot down twice himself. The first time, over the North Sea, he had managed to ditch his aircraft and was picked up by a naval vessel. The second time, over France in 1942, he was wounded and his aircraft was badly damaged, but he brought it back. By the time the war ended, he held the Distinguished Service Order, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the DFC Bar, the last awarded for a second act of distinguished gallantry that warranted specific recognition beyond the first award. He was 30 years old when he was appointed to the king's household. He was well-read, well-spoken, careful with everyone he met. His marriage to Rosemary Pole had produced 2 sons, Giles and Hugo, and appeared, at least from outside, to be functioning. Rosemary later had an affair with John de Laszlo, the son of the portrait painter Philip de Laszlo, and the marriage was dissolved in 1952 on grounds of her adultery. This is a fact that the palace's constitutional advisors would later deploy in their arguments against the Margaret connection. Townsend was the innocent party in the divorce. He had not been unfaithful, but he was, in the eyes of the Church of England, and in the eyes of the Royal Marriages Act's logic, a divorced man, and a divorced man was, in 1953, a category. During the King's illness from 1949 onward, Townsend was present for the private deteriorations that illness creates around it, the changed routine, the shortened days, the rooms where people are managing a weight they do not discuss in front of outsiders. He was present at the various royal residences across those years, with the particular access that an equerry has, which is a step closer than staff and a step further than family. He was not family. He was trusted. The distinction is precise. Margaret was 17 when he was appointed. She was 21 when her father died. Between 1944 and 1952, across 8 years, they had been in the same household at Sandringham, at Windsor, at Balmoral, at Buckingham Palace, at Clarence House. He had watched her become an adult. She had watched him remain something settled and composed through the years of her father's illness that nothing else in the household quite was. The feelings he describes in Time and Chance as developing after the King's death are not, when you read the book, feelings that arrive suddenly. They are feelings that arrive with recognition, as though they had been present in some form for a while and were only now being acknowledged as what they actually were. She felt it first, or she showed it first, which may be the same thing or may not be. The accounts differ on this point with a consistency that suggests it was disputed in real time as well. What both Townsend in his memoir and Margaret's circle in their later accounts agree on is that by early 1953, the feeling between them was understood by both, had not been spoken aloud in any formal way, and was known, without certainty, to a small number of people in the household who had been watching both of them for months. Lascelles knew before the coronation. That is established by his own actions. He was not responding to the lint photograph when he summoned Townsend in June. He was acting on information he had accumulated from the observation that was built into his role. The private secretary to the sovereign is not, in the British system, simply an administrator. He is the guardian of the institution's reputation, which means he is, among other things, an observer of everything that happens inside the household and an assessor of what it means. Lascelles assessed what it meant and concluded that it required immediate management. The memo he wrote to the cabinet following his conversation with Townsend has been declassified and is in the National Archives. It is a document of considerable precision. He lays out the constitutional position under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. He notes that Margaret is 22 and therefore cannot marry without the sovereign's consent. He notes that the sovereign's consent, if given, would require a recommendation from the Prime Minister. He notes that Winston Churchill, who was then Prime Minister, would be in an impossible position, because the Church of England, whose head was the sovereign, did not recognize the remarriage of divorced persons, and Townsend was a divorced person. He notes that the refusal of consent would not necessarily end the matter, because Margaret would turn 25 in 1955, and could at that point notify Parliament of her intention to marry and proceed if Parliament did not object within 12 months. The memo is careful not to recommend a specific course of action. It lays out the positions and leaves the recommendation implied by the structure of its argument. The implied recommendation is removal. Churchill read the memo and conferred with Anthony Eden, who was at that point Foreign Secretary and widely expected to be Churchill's successor. Eden's own position was delicate, because Eden had divorced his first wife Beatrice in 1950 and married Clarissa Spencer Churchill, niece of Churchill himself, in 1952. He was, himself, a divorced man who had remarried, which meant he had a personal interest in not being publicly positioned as an opponent of divorced men's matrimonial prospects. His advice to Churchill, when they conferred, was to proceed carefully. Careful, in this context, meant Brussels. The 2 years of Townsend's posting require attention because they are often treated as a holding pattern, a period in which nothing happened, and that is not what the evidence suggests. The correspondence between Margaret and Townsend during this period has not been published. The letters she sent him were in his possession until his death, and their disposition after his death in 1995 has not been fully documented. His family has maintained privacy on the subject. What is clear is that both parties expected the separation to be temporary, that Margaret expected to turn 25 in August 1955 and to revisit the question, and that the palace, which was now operating under a new Prime Minister and a new Archbishop of Canterbury, was not waiting passively for that date to arrive. Eden succeeded Churchill as Prime Minister in April 1955. He had a personal complication that made his position on the Margaret Townsend question fraught. He was divorced and remarried. Any public line he took that framed divorced persons as unsuitable marriage partners for members of the royal family was a line he was drawing, to some extent, around himself. He navigated this by deferring, consistently, to the Archbishop. Geoffrey Fisher was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1945 to 1961. He was 67 years old in 1955 and had been Archbishop for a decade. He was not a cruel man in any ordinary sense. He was a man who held a position with extreme seriousness and who understood that the position required him, on certain questions, to hold a line that he held partly because it was the line and partly because holding it was what the position demanded. The line on divorce was that the Church of England did not recognize it as dissolving a marriage in the eyes of God, and therefore could not bless the remarriage of a divorced person. He met with Margaret in October 1955, during the 16 days she and Townsend spent together following his return to England. The meeting has been described in various accounts with various degrees of detail. What all accounts agree on is that Fisher told her, with clarity, that if she married Townsend, she would not be able to take communion in the Church of England for a period of 7 years, and that the Church's blessing could not be given to the marriage. He did not threaten her, he did not coerce her, he stated a position. The position happened to be, if you do this, you lose the most significant spiritual community of your life for 7 years. This is different from coercion, but it is also not neutral. When the institution you are embedded in tells you the price of a decision, and when the institution is also the one that controls access to the right that your entire upbringing has made central to how you understand yourself, the statement of a price is a form of pressure, a very old, very composed form of pressure. She made the decision herself. Townsend has always said so, and there is no strong reason to disbelieve him. By October 29, 2 days before the statement was released, she had told him what she intended to do. He accepted it. He did not argue. He said, in the memoir, that he thought she was right, that the forces arranged against them were too large, and the cost to both of them of proceeding would have been too high. He said this 23 years later, in 1978, and whether the passage of 23 years had altered his view, or confirmed it, is something only he knew. The statement on October 31, 1955, was written by Margaret herself. This has been disputed in various accounts, with some suggestions that a draft was provided by the palace or by a courtier. The standard scholarly view, based on the available evidence, is that while she may have had advice on its language, the decision it announced was hers, and the core of the text was hers. It was read at the BBC's 9 o'clock news by a newsreader named Simon Ward. The newspapers printed it in full the next morning. The public reaction was largely sympathetic and largely helpless, the reaction of people watching someone they found compelling make a choice that was correct by the institution's logic and costly by any human one. Townsend drove away from Allen Bay Park on November 1, 1956. He returned to Brussels, then he was posted to Johannesburg, then, when his official posting ended, he settled in France. He married Marie-Luce Germagne in Belgium on December 21, 1959. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a Belgian industrialist. They would have 3 children. He stayed in France for the rest of his life, writing his memoir in the 1970s and giving occasional interviews, living the comfortable life of a man who had chosen his privacy over his proximity to history and who had been given, by the institution that removed him, enough cushion to live it without bitterness. The cushion is worth noting. When Townsend left royal service, he received the standard arrangements available to someone of his rank and standing, a pension commensurate with his service, his decorations in full, and the maintenance of his status as a person with whom the palace would have no quarrel. There was no hostile briefing against him in the press. There was no campaign to characterize him as a predator or an opportunist. He was allowed to be what he had always been, a decorated officer of excellent character who had been in a difficult situation and had handled it with dignity. This was a choice. The palace made it deliberately. A man who has been well treated by an institution is substantially less likely to speak harshly of it than a man who has been punished. Townsend was well treated. He spoke, when he spoke, with care and warmth. The memoir he finally published in 1978 is the memoir of someone who has made peace with the past, or who has chosen to present peace with the past regardless of whether the peace was genuine. The two positions produce the same text. One conversation that rarely gets the attention it deserves in the Townsend story is what his return in October 1955 actually cost him. Not emotionally, which has been documented, but practically. He came back to England after 2 years and 16 days in Brussels for 16 days of private meetings, and then left forever. Those 16 days were the only time he and Margaret spent together after the June 1953 exile, and the evidence suggests, from both parties' later accounts, that the quality of those days was the quality of two people who had maintained something across 2 years and who found, in the 10 yards of private space they were given, that what they had maintained was still real. The October 1955 meetings were at Clarence House and at Major Wills's house in Berkshire, and at another private location whose owner has been described but not publicly named in the standard accounts. There were no photographers at these locations, which required logistical management of the kind that the palace's social network was practiced at providing. The question of who provided it, and who therefore knew exactly where Townsend and Margaret were spending their time, is one of those questions the record does not quite answer. What the record does confirm is that the palace knew where they were, because the palace's ability to monitor the movements of its members was, in this period, substantially better than the press understood at the time. They were being given privacy. The privacy was managed. These are not contradictory. They are the specific kind of tolerated indulgence that an institution extends to a situation it has already decided will resolve itself in a particular way, because the resolution has already been arranged. Margaret understood this. She was the daughter of a king. She had grown up inside the machinery. She knew when she was being given rope, and she knew what the rope was for. She made the statement, she gave the rope back, and the palace moved on, as it always moved on, to the next management problem, which was, within 5 years, her marriage. We are halfway through the account of Margaret's secret circle, and the second half contains what most people who know this story have never seen assembled in one place. The full story of Robin Douglas Home, what happened to his letters, and what those letters said, and the full account of what the Sunday People photograph actually cost, not just in press coverage but in the specific political calculation the palace had to make about how much Margaret was worth protecting. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next video in this series is already scheduled, and now let's continue. The divorce from Armstrong-Jones in 1978 is the case study in the palace's most sophisticated management tool, the gilded cage, not exile, which had been Townsend's instrument, not the tragic early death that surrounded the Douglas Home situation, the gilded cage. You give someone a title, a position, a social world, a career, a financial settlement, and in return for all of it, you do not ask for a formal silence. You create conditions in which silence is the rational choice. Armstrong-Jones received the Earldom of Snowdon in 1961, which was a genuine creative of the peerage rather than a courtesy title, meaning it was his by letters patent and would not lapse with the end of the marriage. He received this regardless of divorce. The title was, in effect, an investment in his continued goodwill that paid returns across 40 years. He also received something that the financial settlement alone cannot account for: continued inclusion. He was not removed from the social world in which he had operated since the 1950s. He continued to receive commissions for photography. He continued to attend events at which members of the royal family were present. He was not made to feel, by the operation of social pressure, that the end of the marriage was the end of his access to the world the marriage had given him. This is more valuable than money, in the specific economy of British social life. Access to the right rooms is how reputations are maintained, how commissions are generated, how the ongoing credibility of a career is sustained. Armstrong-Jones continued to access the right rooms. The access was not accidental. He was also, and this is a smaller point but a real one, a man who had been married to a princess and who understood, with the precision of a photographer who had spent a career reading rooms, that the value of that marriage to his biography was something to be handled with care. A man who speaks badly of a princess he was married to for 18 years does not come out of the speaking well, whatever the truth of what he says. A man who maintains a composed discretion is the man who gets the next commission, the next solo show, the next favorable portrait of himself in the press. He maintained the discretion. He did the math. The math worked. The question that remains open about the Armstrong-Jones settlement is the specific financial terms. The figure that has circulated in various accounts over the years is in the range of £100,000, but this has never been confirmed by any official document, and the palace has never disclosed the terms of the settlement, which is standard practice. What is known is that Margaret continued to receive her civil list allocation, and that Armstrong-Jones was not, after the divorce, in financial difficulty. He ran a successful practice. The title provided him with ongoing social capital. Whatever was arranged financially was sufficient to avoid any public recrimination. He never wrote a memoir about the marriage. He gave interviews, over the subsequent 40 years, that contained occasional personal reflections on Margaret, but that were invariably measured in tone and specific in what they disclosed. He said she was brilliant. He said she was difficult. He said, in a 2008 interview, that he had loved her deeply for a long time, and that the end of the marriage had been painful for both of them. He did not say more than that. The daughter he had with Melanie Cable Alexander, born in 1998 when he was 68 years old, was kept secret for 19 years. The revelation after his death in 2017 suggests that the management of private information was, for Armstrong-Jones, not merely a response to palace pressure, but a personal habit, a way of being in the world that had been built into his character long before his marriage to Margaret, and that outlasted it by 4 decades. He was a private man who had lived a very public life and who had learned, decades before he needed to, that the gap between the public life and the private one was where a person could actually breathe. The 4 men in this account were handled by 4 different instruments, and the differences are revealing. Exile for Townsend, pressure and poverty and death, in a sequence that cannot be fully documented but cannot be fully dismissed, for Douglas Home. The Gilded Cage for Armstrong-Jones, and for Llewellyn, nothing formal or nothing documented, and the voluntary silence of a man who appears to have concluded, on his own, that discretion was who he was. 4 instruments, 4 outcomes, all 4 effective. To understand why the palace had 4 different instruments rather than 1, you have to understand what the institution is actually managing when it manages these situations. It is not managing scandal, not primarily. Scandal is the word the press uses. What the institution is managing is institutional legitimacy, which is more specific than scandal and more fragile. The British monarchy in the 20th century operated on an unusual compact. The compact was something like this. The country granted the institution an extraordinary level of privilege, social, financial, constitutional, and in return, the institution maintained the appearance of a certain kind of life. The appearance was not of perfection. Nobody, by the 1950s, expected the royal family to be perfect. The appearance was of seriousness, of a family that understood the weight of what it was holding and carried it with the appropriate gravity. A family that, when it made mistakes, made them discreetly enough that the compact could be maintained. Margaret was the fracture point in this compact, not because she was immoral or even particularly reckless, because she was honest. Her life was not a life she could make herself perform without the performance becoming visible, and when the performance became visible, the institution's legitimacy was exposed. Not by what she did, by what her presence did to the logic of what the institution claimed to be. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which was the formal instrument that governed Margaret's situation with Townsend, was itself a measure of how seriously the institution took the management of these situations. George III had passed it because several of his brothers had contracted marriages he found unsuitable, and the act gave the sovereign the power to prevent any member of the royal family from marrying anyone the sovereign did not approve of, at least until they turned 25. It remained in force, with modifications, until 2013, when the Succession to the Crown Act reformed it significantly. But the Act was only the formal instrument. The informal instruments were older and more efficient. The informal instrument was what biographer Theo Aronson, in his 1997 study of the royal family, called the machinery of discouragement. The combination of architectural, social, financial, and reputational pressure that the institution could apply to anyone who came too close to one of its members, in a way it considered inconvenient. Townsend received the architectural and geographical variant, Brussels and then Johannesburg. The machinery moved him to where the problem couldn't develop. Douglas Home received something that looks, from the outside, less deliberate but may not have been. He was a man with serious debts and a specific thing the institution wanted him not to do. When he approached the German press with an offer, the establishment response came quickly. What the response consisted of exactly has never been fully documented. What is documented is that he did not proceed with the sale, and that his financial situation did not improve, and that he died with debts and sleeping pills a year after the approach. Whether the response to his approach consisted of a direct intervention, a refusal to provide the help that would have relieved the debts, or simply the withdrawal of whatever social access and professional goodwill had previously existed, is something the record cannot answer with confidence. The open verdict at the inquest means the coroner found evidence consistent with self-administration of the pills, but no definitive proof of deliberate intent. Open verdicts are the appropriate finding when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The ambiguity in this case has never been resolved. Armstrong-Jones received the financial and social variant, a settlement that was adequate, a title that was irreversible, and continued access to the world that had made his career. The machine gave him a reason to stay quiet, by making quiet the rational choice. Llewellyn received, apparently, nothing formal, and yet he has been quiet for 40 years. The mechanism underneath all four cases is the same, and it is older than the 20th century. It is the mechanism of social credit. Every person who lives inside a certain world, whether that world is the British aristocracy, or a professional community, or a small town, accumulates credit in that world through their behavior, their associations, and their adherence to the world's internal codes. The credit can be spent, or it can be maintained, and the choice of whether to spend it is constrained by the knowledge of what happens to people who spend it, in ways the world does not endorse. The specific social credit available to people who move through the world of the British royal family is not small. The invitations, the access, the professional associations, the sense of belonging to a set that considers itself the most significant set in the country, all of it is available to those who maintain the codes. All of it disappears for those who violate them. Townsend understood this. He was a military man, which meant he had spent his career in an institution whose codes were explicit and whose sanctions for violating them were formal. The social machinery of the palace was, by comparison, gentler in its execution and entirely without formal rules. But the logic was identical. You maintained the code, or you lost the world. He maintained the code. He lost, in one sense, the woman. He kept the world. Armstrong-Jones understood it with even greater sophistication, because he had come from outside the world and had watched himself enter it with the analytical eye of a photographer who knew that the image of a thing and the thing itself were different categories of reality. He had entered the royal world without being born into it. He understood its rules, not as nature but as convention, and the understanding of convention rather than nature is precisely the understanding that allows a person to work within conventions strategically. Llewellyn may have understood something simpler, that the alternative to silence was the destruction of the relationship's meaning. To speak about it commercially, to sell the interviews and the archive and the memoir, was to turn it into something it was not. The relationship had been private. The privacy had been the point. Selling the privacy was selling the thing that made it worth having. This is not a naive position. It is a sophisticated one. And it may be the most complete explanation for his silence, because it does not require the assumption of any arrangement with the palace at all. It requires only that he was the person everyone who knew him described, a man of genuine feeling and genuine restraint, who understood that the value of a thing and the value of its public account are not the same. There is a deeper question underneath all of this that the biographies have circled without quite landing on, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The palace did not create the conditions that made these men silent by itself. It used conditions that already existed in the British class and social system. The deference to the institution, the understanding that access to the most significant social world in the country was conditional on not embarrassing it, the willingness of individuals to accept the institution's management of their private lives in exchange for the benefits of proximity. These conditions were not invented by the palace, they were inherited by it from a social structure that had been building them for centuries. What the palace did was use them with the specific efficiency of an institution that had been using them longer than any other in the country. The four men in Margaret's circle were not victims of a conspiracy, exactly. They were people who understood, with varying degrees of clarity, what world they were in, and they made the calculations that world made available to them. Townsend chose dignity over exposure. Armstrong-Jones chose professional continuation over a bitter divorce. Llewellyn chose privacy over money. Douglas Home tried, in desperation, to convert what he knew into the money he needed, and the world made clear that this was the one conversion it would not permit. The result, across 50 years of Margaret's adult life, was an almost complete absence of the male perspective on what being loved by her actually involved. The memoirs that exist are careful. The interviews that were given are measured. The letters are mostly inaccessible. The man who might have been least careful, who might have said the most, is the man who did not survive to say anything. What we have, instead, are the accounts of the women who were closest to her. Glenconner, whose lady-in-waiting is the most valuable primary source available. The women who served as ladies-in-waiting, and who wrote or spoke after her death. The biographers, who assembled the record from what was left. What we do not have, in any complete or unmanaged form, is what these men actually experienced. The palace managed the men managed themselves, and what remains is an outline of a life as it was understood by the institution that contained it, not the life as she actually lived it. By the late 1970s, Princess Margaret was 48 years old, divorced, and in a relationship with a man who was 30 years old, and she understood that the circle she was in was closing. Not because of Roddy Llewellyn, who remained genuinely in her life until the early 1980s, but because of the accumulating weight of the institution's management of everything she had tried to be. There is a tendency, in accounts of her later life, to frame the 1970s and 1980s as a period of decline. The parties that ran too late, the drinking that was real, the cigarettes, 100 a day at her worst, which her doctors told her would kill her, and which she reduced only when the reduction was not a choice she had made, but a physical fact her body was enforcing. The holidays in Mustique, which the press covered as the holidays of someone who was avoiding the country, rather than as the holidays of someone who was doing the only thing that felt like escape from the machinery. The decline narrative is not wrong about the symptoms. It is wrong about the diagnosis. What was actually happening to Margaret in the 1970s and 1980s was not a personal disintegration. It was the result of 50 years of being managed by an institution that had never given her a function, only constraints. She had been told, at 22, that she could not marry the man she loved. She had been given, at 29, a marriage that the institution approved because Armstrong-Jones was, whatever else he was, not a divorced commoner. She had been watched through 18 years of that marriage, had her affairs noted, and her movements monitored, and her spending tracked, and had been, at the end of it, the subject of the first royal divorce in 400 years, which the same institution that had prevented her first choice now found itself managing as a public relations problem. She had then found, in Roddy Llewellyn, something that felt like the private life she had been trying to locate since 1952, and the press had published a photograph of it. The consequence of all this was not a party that ran too late, or a drink that was one more than was wise. The consequence was a woman who had been fighting the institution from the inside for 40 years, and who had, in the late 1970s, run out of positions from which to fight. The alcohol and the cigarettes and the holidays were what fighting from no position looks like in a person who still has enough resources to soften the view. Glenconner, who was with her for much of this period, writes about it with a compassion that does not romanticize it. She describes Margaret in the late 1970s as someone who could still be the most brilliant company in any room she entered, and who was, outside the rooms, struggling with a life she had never chosen, and that the institution was not going to change because she was struggling with it. The smoking killed her slowly. The first stroke came in January 1998, at Les Jolies Eaux in Mustique. She was 67 years old. The stroke affected her vision in one eye, but left her otherwise largely functional, and she returned to London and continued her schedule of engagements with the stoicism that the family did by then require as a minimum. The word for it in the official communiques was minor. It was not minor, it was the first in a series of strokes that would, across the following 4 years, reduce her from a woman whose physical presence could still command a room to a woman who could barely navigate it. In 1999, she scalded her feet in a bath at Les Jolies Eaux. The scalding occurred because the stroke had affected her sensitivity to temperature, and she did not register the water as too hot until the damage was done. The burns required treatment and left her with permanent skin damage. Her feet, which had been a private vanity of hers, something she had taken care of throughout her adult life, were burned. The detail is small and not small. Further strokes followed in 2001 and in early 2002. By the last year of her life, she had lost much of the use of her left hand. Her vision had deteriorated substantially. She could no longer play the piano, which was a loss she did not discuss in public, but which the people who knew her understood to be among the most significant things the strokes had taken. She died at the King Edward VII Hospital in London on the morning of February 9, 2002. She was 71 years old. The Queen was at Sandringham. The family was notified. The announcement was made by Buckingham Palace at noon, with the standard language of royal deaths that the palace uses because the language was agreed upon long before anyone who used it was born. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on February 15, 2002. It was a private funeral, not the ceremonial state funeral that would follow her mother's death 7 weeks later, but it was attended by the family and by the people who had been her actual circle across 50 years, which included Colin Tennant and Anne Glenconner, and the household who had served her, and the various people who had been in and out of her life since the 1950s. Roddy Llewellyn attended. He was photographed arriving. Peter Townsend was dead by then. He had died in 1995 in Normandy. He did not know, and did not need to know, how she had died, because everything about the manner of his going had been arranged at a distance of 40 years from the October 31, 1955 statement. Antony Armstrong-Jones, now the Earl of Snowdon, did not attend the funeral. This has been noted, but not fully explained in the accounts. The official reason given was that his attendance might attract disproportionate media attention on a day that was intended to focus on the family. This is a plausible reason. It is also the kind of reason the palace uses when it has a more complex reason it would prefer not to state. The accounting of what her managed life cost her is not, in the end, a financial one. The financial costs to the palace were real. The civil list allocation, the Kensington Palace apartments maintained across decades, the staff, the security, the management of various situations that required various instruments. These are documented in aggregate, if not in detail. The accounting that matters is harder to quantify. It is the accounting of a life that contained, in its first 50 years, 1 man she could not have, and 2 marriages to men the institution approved and found workable for its own reasons, and it is the accounting of what that pattern produced in the person who lived it. Craig Brown, in Ma'am Darling, refuses to reduce her to either a victim or a villain, and his refusal is the most accurate position available. She was not a victim of the institution in any simple sense, because she was also deeply embedded in the institution's privileges and genuinely attached to many of its elements. She loved being a princess. She loved the access and the attention and the rooms it opened. She did not want to give those rooms up. She wanted to have both the rooms and the life inside them, and the institution's specific cruelty was not that it denied her the rooms, but that it made the life inside them conditional on a managed performance that ate, across 50 years, the private person it was managing. What the private person was, underneath the performance, is what the letters that nobody has fully published would show us. The letters to Townsend, the letters to Douglas Home, the notes and diary entries and private correspondence that sits in the Royal Archive and in private hands and in the estates of people who were in her circle and who have not yet decided what to do with what they hold. We do not have those documents. What we have is what survives the management, the public record, the managed memoir, the measured interview. We have the shape of what was silenced, even if we do not have the sound of it. The sound was a woman who could sing before she could read, who did impressions that made her father laugh, who played piano in a way that professional musicians found genuinely good, who understood which gap to find between what a person said and what they meant, who looked at every room she entered with eyes that were taking the full inventory of everything it contained, and who spent 7 decades inside an institution that found all of those qualities easier to manage than to accommodate. She died on a Saturday morning in a hospital in Marylebone. She was the last person to remember the abdication from the inside of the family. She had been watching since she was 6 years old. There is a detail about Peter Townsend's posting to Brussels that gets left out of most accounts, and it matters because it changes what the exile actually looked like from inside it. Air attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels is not a low-status position. It is not Siberia. It is not the career equivalent of being sent to clean out a filing room in a basement. The posting carried rank, staff, social obligations, access to the diplomatic world of a European capital, and the ongoing professional status of a decorated group captain serving the crown abroad. Townsend attended diplomatic dinners. He met heads of state. He was a person of consequence in the specific world of Anglo-Belgian diplomatic and military life. The exile was comfortable. This is part of what made it effective. Townsend was 40 years old when he arrived in Brussels. He had a career, a social life, a man's world to navigate, and the specific energy that comes from maintaining composed functionality while carrying something heavy that nobody around you has permission to discuss. He functioned. He attended the dinners. He wrote letters that arrived at Clarence House and did not leave Clarence House except on private arrangements that the palace knew about, because the palace knew about everything that moved in and out of Clarence House. The letters have never been published. This is the single most significant gap in the documentary record of this relationship. Everything that is known about what passed between them across those 2 years of official separation is known either from Townsend's memoir, which is careful with specifics, or from the accounts of people around Margaret, who were themselves working from inference and observation rather than the content of the correspondence. What Glenconner says about Margaret during this period, in Lady in Waiting, is that she was determined. Determined is a specific word for someone to choose about a friend in that situation. Not heartbroken, which would be the sentimental word. Not resigned, which would be the defeated word. Determined. The determination was that the situation was temporary, that the mechanism that had moved him was a mechanism that could be reversed, and that reversing it was a matter of patience and the calendar. She had the calendar correctly. She turned 25 on August 21st, 1955. From that birthday, the Royal Marriages Act's consent requirement no longer applied in the same absolute form. She could, theoretically, give Parliament 12 months' notice of her intention to marry and proceed if Parliament did not object. The people advising her made sure she understood both the theory and its practical complications. The practical complications were substantial. Parliament objecting was a real possibility, not a remote one. The Church of England's position had not changed. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who held the position in 1955, was not a man who would change it, simply because the young woman in question had turned 25. The Commonwealth, whose member states had just celebrated the coronation of a new queen with genuine ceremony, was not indifferent to what the Queen's sister did with her private life, and several prime ministers of Commonwealth countries had already made clear through back channels that their populations were not prepared for this particular news. Eden, who had succeeded Churchill in April 1955, and who had his own personal investment in the position of divorced persons in British public life, navigated the situation by maintaining, publicly, that he had no position, and communicating, privately, through the same back channels, that the government could not recommend to Parliament that it make no objection. He did not tell Margaret directly. He told the people who told the people who told the people who could reach her. The British constitutional system, when it wants to say no without anyone saying no to anyone's face, is extraordinarily good at it. The Archbishop did tell her directly. The meeting in October 1955, when Townsend had returned, and the two of them were having those 16 days at various private locations, included a meeting with Geoffrey Fisher that has been described by multiple sources as the moment the situation clarified for Margaret in a way she could no longer navigate around. Fisher was precise. He was not unkind. He gave her the Church's position in the language of the Church, which is the language of principle rather than the language of consequence, and which is all the more effective for that, because principle does not negotiate. What Fisher told her about communion has already been covered. What has not been covered is the smaller, more personal element that the biographies describe but do not always emphasize. He told her that the marriage, if it proceeded, would be outside the church, not the people. The marriage itself would be outside the structure she had been inside all her life. She would be married, in the sense the civil law recognized. She would not be married in the sense her family, her faith, and her upbringing had given her for the word. She was 25 years old. She had been raised in the Church of England in the specific way that children of the royal family are raised in it, which is not the casual observance of someone who attends Christmas services and Easter services and is otherwise unengaged, but the full structural commitment of a family for which the church is constitutionally inseparable from what they are. The sacraments mattered to her. They had mattered since childhood. The idea of a marriage that the church would not recognize was not an abstraction. It was a specific absence in the center of what the marriage would mean. Townsend understood this. He said so, in the memoir, and he said it without self-pity, which is the more convincing register for a thing like that. He said that what she faced was a choice between two real things, not a choice between one real thing and one abstract duty. The faith was real. He was real. The choice was between them. She chose the faith, or she chose the institution, or she chose to avoid the specific losses that marriage to him would require. Losses that included not just the church's blessing, but her civil list income and her place in the succession, such as it was, given she was never going to be queen regardless, and the social world she inhabited as princess, rather than the social world she would have inhabited as the wife of a retired RAF officer living in France. The multiple calculations involved in that October 1955 decision have never been fully disentangled from each other, and they may not have been fully distinguishable inside Margaret's own head. When we are choosing between love and everything else we know, the word duty is often what we reach for to describe a combination of practical concerns and emotional limits and spiritual commitments that we cannot fully articulate even to ourselves. She issued the statement. He drove away. What happened to him afterward is, in its way, as revealing as what happened during the crisis. He went back to Brussels. The following year, 1956, he was posted from Brussels to Johannesburg as air attaché at the British High Commission in South Africa. This was a further posting abroad, another step of managed distance that kept him outside England and outside the immediate orbit of the story he was now part of. In Johannesburg, he continued to function, continued to attend the diplomatic world, continued to write. He began working on the book that would eventually become Time and Chance, though it would not be published for more than 20 years. In 1959, he retired from the RAF with the rank of group captain. He settled in France, initially near Paris, eventually in the Normandy village of Le Moulin de la Tuilerie. He married Marie-Luce Jamagne on December 21, 1959. She was a Belgian national, 19 years old, on the day of the wedding. Townsend was 45. They had met in Belgium during his Brussels posting. The marriage was, by the accounts available, a good one. They had 3 children, Pierre, Hugo, and Marie-France. He lived in France for the rest of his life, 36 years, between his retirement and his death in 1995. He grew roses in his garden. He wrote. He was, by the limited evidence available, genuinely at peace with the way things had turned out, or at least genuinely committed to behaving as though he were, which in a person of his character and self-discipline amounts to the same thing. He published Time and Chance in 1978. He was 63 years old. Margaret was 48. She was still alive, still resident at Kensington Palace 1A, still receiving her civil list allocation, still navigating the aftermath of a divorce from Armstrong-Jones that had been finalized the same year the memoir appeared. He did not call her before publication. He did not send her a copy of the manuscript. He had not, as far as any source records, spoken to her since November 1955. The book was his account. The courtesy of advance notice was not one the relationship's end had made obligatory in any formal sense, and he chose not to offer it. She read the book. What she thought of it, and whether the reading of it in 1978 cost her anything, is something the people who were around her at the time describe only obliquely. Glenn Connor does not say. The other ladies in waiting who have written memoirs do not say. The book was reviewed extensively. It was on the bestseller lists. It was respectful and careful, and told the story of the relationship without any of the anger or exposure that the press had been anticipating for 23 years. He gave one interview around the publication to a journalist whose name has been reported differently in different accounts of it, but whose transcript has been described by people who saw it. He said she was the most wonderful woman he had ever known. Margaret, in the years after 1978, said nothing on the record about the memoir and nothing on the record about Townsend. She had learned by then, or had been made to understand, that the press would take anything she said on this subject and construct whatever story best fit the moment. She chose not to contribute to the construction. He died on June 19, 1995. He was 80 years old. His wife Marie-Luce was 55. He died at home in Normandy, as he had said he wanted to. Margaret was 64 years old when he died. She had had 3 more years with Roddy Llewellyn. She had had the strokes, and the damaged feet, and the cigarettes and the lunches in Kensington Palace that ran past 4 in the afternoon, and the evenings at the theatre, and the evenings at private parties, where she sat at the piano after dinner and played the songs she had known since the 1940s. She had had a life. It was not the life she would have chosen at 22. Whether she would have chosen it at 64 is a different question, and not one she answered for the record. Colin Tennant gave Princess Margaret a plot of land on the island of Mustique as a wedding present in 1960. She did not visit the island until 1960. By the time she had the Villa Les Jolies Eaux built in the late 1960s to the design of Oliver Messel, the theatrical designer and uncle of Antony Armstrong-Jones, Mustique had become something that no other location in her life was, a place where the performance was optional. Mustique in the late 1960s and 1970s was not the slightly more accessible Caribbean resort it became in later decades. It was a private island, a few miles of volcanic terrain and beach off the southern coast of St. Vincent, that Colin Tennant had bought in 1958, and that he had spent the following years developing at his own expense and according to his own preferences. The preferences were bohemian, in a specific aristocratic English way, houses built for privacy, guests invited on the basis of personal relationship rather than professional category, an atmosphere in which the conventions of the London social world were observed just enough to maintain form and dropped the moment they became inconvenient. The island had no hotels in the early years. It had no press corps. It had no satellite technology that could transmit photographs instantaneously. It had difficult sea access that meant the unauthorized arrival of a boat was detectable before it reached shore. Tennant controlled who came and who went, with the straightforward authority of a man who owned the land and the buildings, and could, if he chose, ensure that a guest who caused problems was not invited back. This is the context in which Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn spent time together from 1973 onward. The Villa Les Jolies Eaux sat on Jeliceau Bay, on the southwestern tip of the island. It had 5 bedrooms, a pool, and a staff of local people who had been working on the island since Tennant developed it. It faced a beach that was not accessible from the main road. The approach by sea was visible from the house. For 3 years, from August 1973 to February 1976, this worked. The British press either did not know about the relationship or, if some editors knew, found the logistics of confirming and photographing it prohibitive enough that they held their hands. The foreign press ran occasional items, with the imprecision of sources writing about something they have at second hand, but nothing that stuck. Then, in February 1976, a reporter from the Sunday People named Arthur Edwards, or, in other accounts, an independent photographer whose name varies across sources, made the crossing by boat without Tennant's knowledge and got the photograph. The full sequence of events around the photograph's acquisition, its editorial decision at the Sunday People, and its publication on February 22, 1976, has been described by various parties in ways that do not entirely agree. What is established is, the photograph was taken without the subject's knowledge or consent, on a beach they had been using for several years as a private space. The photograph showed 2 adults in swimwear on a beach. The relationship between them was not evident from the photograph alone, but the caption and the accompanying text made the identification and the framing clear. The editorial decision to publish was made under the editor Barry Askew, who has described it in interviews as a straightforward news decision. This is what is happening. This is who is involved. The public interest is clear. The decision was controversial enough within the paper's own newsroom that the account of how it was made has been the subject of some dispute, but the decision was made and the photograph was published. The public response was immediate. The story ran on the front pages of every British national newspaper within 48 hours, with varying degrees of restraint in how the implications were framed. The tabloids ran it as a scandal. The broadsheets ran it as a constitutional and financial story, with references to Margaret's civil list allocation. The BBC ran it as news. Roddy Llewellyn was 28 years old. He had not sought public life. His father, Sir Harry Llewellyn, was a public figure, an Olympic gold medalist, a well-regarded figure in Welsh society, and the photograph brought his son into a public conversation in which his son had no prepared position and no institutional support. He made no statement. He had no press secretary. He was, on the morning of February 22, 1976, a private person whose face was on the front page of a national newspaper next to a princess, and he had nothing to say about it that the press would accept as adequate. The consequences for Margaret were more structured, because Margaret had an institution behind her, even if the institution was also the mechanism through which the consequences arrived. The formal separation from Armstrong-Jones was announced in mid-March 1976. Whether this had been planned before the photograph, or whether the photograph accelerated a plan, or whether the photograph made the continuation of the fiction of the marriage genuinely untenable, in a way it had not previously been, is something the palace's internal communications have not been made public enough to resolve. What is clear from the sequence is that the announcement of the separation followed the publication of the photograph by approximately 3 weeks, and that the formal public acknowledgement of the separation removed the last structural reason for maintaining the pretense that the Mustique visits were simple holidays. Willie Hamilton's parliamentary intervention, calling for a review of Margaret's civil list allocation in light of the photograph's implications about how her time was being spent, was taken seriously in enough corners of Westminster to require a formal response. The response was the standard one. The government had no plans to review the civil list. The princess's personal life was a private matter, and the press should exercise appropriate restraint. None of these statements addressed the substance of Hamilton's point, which was whether it was appropriate for public money to fund a lifestyle that included extended Caribbean holidays with a companion 17 years younger than the recipient. The statements were not designed to address the substance. They were designed to move the story along. Roddy Llewellyn's life in the 3 years following the photograph has been described by people who knew him as a period of serious difficulty. He was not suited to the public scrutiny the photograph had created, and he had no training, professional or personal, for managing it. He spent time, during 1977 and 1978, at Surrendell Farm in Wiltshire, a small holding that functioned as a kind of informal commune for a group of people in their 20s who were variously finding their way in the years following the political and cultural disruptions of the mid-1970s. The farm period has attracted commentary in the biographies, mostly as illustration of his unsettledness during those years. It is described sympathetically by people who knew him, and with varying degrees of gentleness by people who did not. What it actually represented, by most accounts, was a young man in his late 20s who had been publicly identified with a royal person in terms that made his ordinary life in London temporarily untenable, and who was trying to find somewhere quieter to figure out what happened next. What happened next was gardens. He discovered, during the late 1970s, that he was genuinely good at understanding how landscapes worked, how plants moved through space, how a garden could be designed to tell a story about the land it occupied. He trained at the Chelsea Physic Garden, which is the right place to train if you are serious about horticulture, rather than simply interested in it. And by the early 1980s, he had built the beginning of a practice in landscape garden design that would sustain him for the following 4 decades. The relationship with Margaret continued, in the accounts of people who were around both of them, until approximately 1981. He married Tatiana Soskin in July 1981, which provides a convenient marker, though relationships rarely end precisely when a subsequent marriage begins. What is consistent across the accounts is that by the early 1980s, the sustained involvement of the Mustique years had become a friendship, and the friendship continued, with varying degrees of contact and warmth, until the end of her life. He was at her funeral. He stood at a respectful distance from the family, He did not speak to the press. She told Glenconner, in the period after the relationship had settled into friendship, that he had been genuinely important to her, not in the way Townsend had been important, which was the way of a first and defining love, but in the way that a person who finds you funny and enjoys your company and asks nothing of your performance is important to someone who has been performing, without a break, for 40 years. He had asked nothing of her performance. He had laughed at her jokes, which were still genuinely good. He had sat on the beach at Mustique and watched the water with her, and not required her to be a princess while they were watching it. In the specific economy of her life, where every relationship outside the few people she fully trusted required some version of the royal manner, this was not small. It was, in fact, the one thing none of the management instruments could give her. The exile that managed Townsend could not give it. The title and settlement that managed Armstrong-Jones could not give it. The pressure and poverty that surrounded Douglas home certainly could not give it. What it was the experience of not being managed. And in a life that had been managed since the age of 6, an experience of that kind was worth, apparently, a photograph on the front page of the Sunday People and the parliamentary attention of Willie Hamilton. Whether it was worth enough, at the end, is a question she left unanswered. The Royal Archive at Windsor Castle is one of the largest and most carefully maintained private archives in Britain. It contains documents from the reign of George III onward, official correspondence, private letters, diaries, photographs, files, memoranda, and the accumulated paper of a family that has been producing paper of institutional and historical significance for more than 200 years. Access to the archive is controlled by the Keeper of the Royal Archives, who is appointed by the Sovereign and answers to the Sovereign's household. The archive is not a public institution. It is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Documents held within it are not automatically released after a set number of years, the way that cabinet papers and other government documents are released under the 30-year or 20-year rules. The archive's own rules determine what is accessible to researchers, and those rules are the rules the archive makes for itself. This matters for the story of Princess Margaret's private life, because the documents that bear most directly on her relationships, particularly the correspondence with Townsend and the letters written in the Douglas home period, are documents that would, if held in a public archive, have been available to researchers for decades. The Royal Marriages Act documents held in the Cabinet Office have been released. The Lascelles memo is in the National Archives. The internal correspondence of the Archbishop of Canterbury's office from 1955 has been partially accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials through Lambeth Palace Library. But the private correspondence, the letters that passed between Margaret and the men she loved, is a different category. The letters Townsend sent her are presumably part of her personal papers, which passed to her estate at her death in 2002. The management of her estate has not been publicly documented in a way that identifies the disposition of correspondence. The letters she sent to Townsend were in his possession until his death in 1995, and their disposition after his death has been handled by his family, who have maintained appropriate privacy. The Douglas home letters present a more complicated situation. The letters Margaret sent to Douglas home were in his possession at the time of his death in 1968. His estate was handled at that point by whoever had authority over it, and the evidence of what happened to the letters is inconsistent across sources. Some accounts suggest that letters or copies of letters were acquired by persons acting on behalf of the palace in the weeks following his death. Other accounts suggest that the letters remained in private hands for a substantial period after his death, and that some have found their way into the hands of collectors or institutions through the normal market in historical documents. What is established is that no major journalistic publication of the letters themselves has occurred. The references to their content that appear in biographies and journalistic accounts are based on descriptions provided by people who have seen them, or who have been told of their content by people who have seen them, rather than on the text of the letters themselves. Craig Brown, whose research for Ma'am Darling was more extensive than most, describes the letters' existence and general character without publishing extracts. The absence of the published letters is itself a form of the palace's management. Not a management the palace necessarily orchestrated in this specific case, but a management that results from the combination of the normal instruments of privacy law, estate control, and the social dynamics of a world in which the people who hold historically significant documents often find that discretion is the wiser commercial and personal choice. The question of what the archive holds that has not been made public is not, in this case, primarily a question about documents the palace has suppressed. The palace's specific suppression has been documented where it occurred: the Lascelles intervention in 1953, the management of the cabinet's involvement in the 1955 crisis, the arrangements surrounding the formal separation and divorce from Armstrong-Jones. These are all in some form in the record. What is not in the record is the interior life, the specific texture of what Margaret felt across the decades of a managed life. The letters are the closest proxy for that texture, and the letters are not available. What we have instead, as has been noted, is the testimony of women who were around her. Glenconner's Lady-in-Waiting is the most substantial of these accounts, but it is itself a careful document, written by a woman who loved Margaret and who understood that what she published would be read against the full weight of Margaret's public reputation, which by 2019 included the television drama The Crown and everything that had been written about her since her death in 2002. Glenconner describes a private person who was funnier, kinder, more genuinely curious, and more genuinely lonely than the public version suggested. She describes a woman who, when the household was not watching and the performance was not required, was someone worth knowing for the quality of what she brought to a room, not for the fact of who she was. She describes a woman who understood her position in the family with a clarity that was sometimes painful to witness, who knew what she was not going to be, and who had the intelligence to identify what the knowing cost her, and the pride to pay the cost without complaining about it in company. The private Margaret and the public Margaret were not two different people. They were two registers of the same person, one managed by the institution, and one by her own preferences. The men who came into her life in the private register, who saw something of the unmanaged version, were the men the institution subsequently needed to manage. The circularity is its own kind of cruelty. What the archive does hold, and what has been released in enough quantity to shape the historical record, is the institutional side of the story, the correspondence between advisors, the cabinet memos, the formal letters from one official position to another. These documents tell the story of an institution managing a situation. They do not tell the story of two people who loved each other and could not be together. The two stories overlap but do not coincide. The overlap is where the history has been written. The places where they don't coincide, where the institution's version and the private version diverge, are the places that are still dark. The darkness has its own testimony, in the form of what we know was said or written, but what we cannot read. Townsend's letters to Margaret, presumably somewhere in the estate. Margaret's letters to Townsend, in the hands of his family in Normandy, or wherever they ended up after 1995. The full correspondence with Douglas Home, the diaries she is said to have kept, whose location and accessibility are not publicly documented. The diaries are a separate consideration. Several people who were close to Margaret in her later years have mentioned, in interviews and in print, that she kept diaries on and off throughout her adult life. What happened to those diaries is not something the public record resolves. If they exist somewhere in the management of her estate that has not been publicly described. If they were destroyed, there is no documentation of that either. Craig Brown writes, in a passage in Ma'am Darling that is careful and specific, that the documentary record of Margaret's inner life is substantially thinner than one might expect for a woman of her historical significance. He traces this to multiple causes: the family's culture of privacy, the specific circumstances of the relationships involved, and the normal attrition of private papers over time. He does not allege a deliberate suppression campaign. He notes an absence and identifies the most plausible explanations for it. The most plausible explanation is not conspiracy. It is the accumulation of small, individual decisions made by people who were each acting in their own interest, that together produce the same effect as a coordinated effort. Townsend chose to publish a memoir that was careful rather than one that was complete. Armstrong-Jones chose not to publish at all. Llewellyn chose silence. The people who held Douglas Home's letters made their own choices. Each choice, on its own, is comprehensible and even sympathetic. The aggregate is a woman whose private life remains, 20 years after her death, substantially inaccessible. The palace did not need to organize this. The palace simply created, over the course of a century, the conditions in which people who came close to its most difficult member made the decisions they made. The system produced the outcome without requiring anyone to give any specific order. The system is not unique to the British monarchy. It is the system that any institution with significant social and financial power operates when it encounters a situation it cannot control directly. The instruments are always the same: status, access, financial arrangement, social inclusion and exclusion, and the understanding, embedded so deeply in the affected parties that it operates without articulation, that the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of staying quiet. The palace was, and is, very good at making people understand this. It did not invent the understanding, it inherited it, along with everything else, from a social structure that had been building it since before the archive began. The word paid in the title of this account needs to be examined more carefully than it has been, because the payment in each case was real, but the currency was different, and the difference matters for understanding what the palace was actually doing. With Peter Townsend, the payment was financial in a conventional sense, to the extent that a pension and maintained status constitute financial compensation for a career disrupted by institutional management. It was also social: the preservation of his reputation, the absence of hostile briefing, the maintenance of a relationship between him and the institution that was correct and civil rather than adversarial. He was not made an enemy of the palace, he was made a managed absence. The distinction is the difference between debt and credit. He owed the institution nothing after he left, because the institution had chosen to treat him well, and treating him well had cost the institution very little while purchasing, across 35 years, his principled discretion. With Armstrong-Jones, the payment was more complex because the relationship lasted longer, and the management had to operate over a longer period. The title was the most visible element. The Earldom of Snowdon, created in 1961, was created in part because the palace wanted Armstrong-Jones to have a status in the world that was commensurate with being the Queen's brother-in-law, which made it less strange for him to be present at events and in circles where his presence might otherwise require explanation. But the title also served the palace's interests in the marriage's aftermath. A man who holds an earldom that he keeps after a divorce is a man whose relationship with the institution that created the title remains generally positive, because the alternative, a public adversarial relationship with the institution that nevertheless continues to hold the title, is available to him, but uncomfortable. Armstrong-Jones understood this. He was too intelligent not to. The management of his relationship with the palace over the 4 decades following his divorce is the work of a man who understood his position in a negotiation, and who chose, at each stage, to take the settlement rather than to fight the settlement. He was adequately compensated. He was socially maintained. He was professionally supported. He returned the investment with a discretion that lasted until his death in 2017. With Robin Douglas home, the payment was the absence of support rather than a positive provision. The palace did not pay Douglas home in any documented sense. What it did was maintain the conditions in which his debts accumulated and his options narrowed, and the specific moment when he tried to convert what he knew into money he needed, the approach to Neue Review, was met with a response that is documented in its existence but not in its specific character. What we know is that the approach did not succeed, that the sale did not occur, and that Douglas home's financial situation did not improve after the attempt. Whether the palace intervened directly to prevent the sale, or whether the threat of exposure via the palace's legal and social resources was sufficient to end the negotiation without formal intervention, is something the existing record cannot confirm. What it can confirm is the consequence: no sale, no publication, no relief of debts, and 9 months later, an open verdict in a Berkshire inquest. The payment to Douglas home, if it can be called that, was negative rather than positive. It was the withdrawal of options. When you are the nephew of a former prime minister, when you move through a social world in which the palace's preferences are the gravitational center around which everything else orbits, the withdrawal of the social credit that world provides is a form of pressure that does not require anyone to issue a formal threat. It operates through the normal mechanics of a world in which belonging is conditional on compliance. Douglas home was not compliant. He was desperate, which is different. and the distinction is one the institution he was navigating did not make. With Roddy Llewellyn, as has been established, no documented payment of any kind occurred. He was not exiled, he was not financially supported, he was not made an earl, he was simply allowed to be who he was, which was a private person who had had a private relationship with a princess and who chose, for reasons entirely his own, to remain private about it. The palace's specific contribution to his silence was, in the best reading of the available evidence, nothing, which means his silence was entirely his own, and that is its own kind of statement about the man. The question that follows from this accounting is, what did the palace buy with all of this? The answer, taken across the 4 cases, is time. The specific thing the palace's management of each of these situations purchased was not a permanent resolution. The story of Margaret's private life has not been suppressed permanently. We know about Townsend, we know about Douglas Home, in the general outline if not in the letters, we know about Armstrong-Jones, we know about Llewellyn. The management did not prevent this knowledge from existing. What it purchased was time, the specific intervals in which the information was not available in a form that could damage the functioning of the monarchy at the moment the monarchy most needed to function without distraction. In 1953 and 1955, the monarchy was newly installed. The coronation had generated an extraordinary investment of public goodwill, particularly in the Commonwealth. A public crisis around the Queen's sister's relationship with a divorced equerry, at that precise moment, would have arrived at the worst possible time for an institution that was investing heavily in its own ceremonial renewal. The exile of Townsend and the subsequent management of the 1955 crisis gave the institution 5 years of stability it would not have had if the relationship had been allowed to develop publicly. In the late 1960s, when the Armstrong-Jones marriage was in visible difficulty and Douglas Home was approaching German magazines with royal correspondence, the palace was managing a more complex public picture, the generational tension within the family, the question of what the monarchy was for in a rapidly changing Britain, the beginning of the media period in which the royal family's internal life was increasingly treated as a subject of public entertainment rather than public reverence. The management of the Douglas Home situation, whatever form it took, kept one specific version of that internal life out of a German illustrated magazine. After the Sunday People photograph in 1976, the palace's management shifted. It could not suppress what was already public. What it managed instead was the framing, the separation announcement, the management of Margaret's civil list position, the eventual divorce. These were not suppressions, they were the management of a public narrative that had already partially escaped the institution's control. The photograph in 1976 was, in that sense, the moment the management's limits became visible. The palace could manage men who could be moved or paid or pressured or persuaded. It could not manage a photograph taken from a boat by someone who was not inside the social world it controlled. This is a distinction that the institution has lived with since, and that has only become more pressing as the technologies of photography and communication have made the distance between a private beach and a front page smaller and smaller. The legacy of the management, taken as a whole, is a historical record that has the shape of a life without its actual texture. We know the events, the coronation, the Brussels posting, the 1955 statement, the 1960 marriage, the various scandals and separations, the 1976 photograph, the 1978 divorce, the strokes, and the death in 2002. We know the institutional framework, the Royal Marriages Act, the cabinet memos, the church's position, the civil list. We know the testimony of the women who were around her, Glenn Connor, the other ladies in waiting, the household members who wrote or spoke after her death. What we do not have is the experience from inside it. What Townsend felt on the evening of October 31st, 1955, after he drove away from Allen-Bay Park. What Margaret felt in the 16 days before she issued the statement, specifically, in the private hours of those 16 days. What Douglas Home wrote to her, and what she wrote back. What Llewellyn actually understood about her during the years in Mustique, when the management was working, and the beach was private, and the performance was optional. These things are not available. The management made sure of some of the unavailability, and time and individual choice made sure of the rest. The result is a historical figure whom the institution has, in the most precise sense, managed into legend, which is not the same as understood. The account of the men in Margaret's life has, necessarily, focused on what the palace did with them after they entered that life. But the people who knew her best, who were present for the most significant moments of her private and public life, were mostly not the men. They were the women who served as her ladies-in-waiting, her friends, her household, and who produced, in the years after her death, the testimony that has shaped the modern understanding of who she was. Anne Glenconner is the most significant of these witnesses. She met Margaret in the late 1950s through the network of aristocratic and social families that Margaret moved through, and she served as lady-in-waiting from 1971 until Margaret's death in 2002. She was, in that role, a participant in the daily life of the household in a way that the biographers and journalists were not. She was in the room for the private meals, the country weekends, the evenings in Kensington Palace that ran past midnight, the mornings after those evenings. She was in Mustique during the years of the Llewellyn relationship. She was in the villa when the Sunday People photograph's consequences arrived. Her memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, published in 2019, when Glenconner was 86 years old, is remarkable for several reasons. It is honest about Margaret's cruelties, which were real, the sudden dismissals, the humiliations of staff, the demands that were excessive by any reasonable standard, the way the household ran on her moods, in a manner that made everyone in it permanently alert to which Margaret was in the room that day. Glenconner does not excuse these. She contextualizes them, which is different and more useful. The contextualization is that Margaret was a woman whose genuine gifts, her intelligence, her musical ability, her social fluency, her capacity for friendship, were never given a formal outlet in the way that her sister's gifts were given an outlet, because the institution did not have a formal outlet for the Queen's sister, and the informal outlets available to a woman of her position in post-war Britain were the ones Margaret exhausted and found insufficient across the first 30 years of her adult life. The cruelties, in Glenconner's account, were the behavior of a person in pain. This is not an unusual or particularly insightful observation about difficult behavior in general. What makes it specific and meaningful in Margaret's case is the precision with which Glenconner identifies the pain, not the Townsend loss specifically, not the Armstrong-Jones marriage specifically, not the photograph and its aftermath specifically, but the cumulative weight of a life that had never been organized around what she was actually capable of and what she actually needed. She was capable of real work. The piano was real work, and the standard she achieved on it was the standard of someone who had practiced seriously for decades. Her knowledge of the theatre and of visual art was not a patron's knowledge, but a practitioner's, someone who had looked hard at things and formed opinions worth arguing with. Her capacity for friendship, documented in Glenconner's account and in other testimony, was the capacity of someone who could be present for the people she loved in a way that required genuine attention and emotional generosity. These are not small things. She never had a job. The word is stark, and the starkness is the point. She never had a place to be on a Tuesday morning that required something of her, in the way that Peter Townsend's job required something of him. She never had the thing that Lady Sarah Chatto, her daughter, eventually found: the gallery on Cork Street, the Tuesday morning in the studio, the answer to the telephone call. Margaret had royal engagements, which are not nothing, but which are also not the thing that a person of her specific kind of intelligence needs for her particular kind of functioning. The men who came into her life were, in some sense, substitutes for the things she could not have. Not because she was seeking substitutes consciously, but because the energy she would have put into work, into a career, into the daily structure of a life organized around something she was good at, went somewhere, and in the absence of a formal outlet, it went into the relationships that the institution then had to manage. This is not an argument that the palace was solely responsible for the choices she made. She was an adult making adult choices with the resources she had. But the resources she had were constrained in specific ways by specific institutional decisions made before she was born and reinforced throughout her life. And those constraints produced, across 7 decades, the pattern of intense private relationships in unsuitable circumstances that then required management. The management produced the silencing. The silencing produced the historical inaccessibility, and the inaccessibility is what we are still navigating, 20 years after her death, when we try to understand what her life was actually like from inside it. Glenn Connor's memoir is the closest any published document has come to answering that question. It is not a complete answer, because no single witness's account of another person's life can be complete, and because Glenn Connor herself, writing in her mid-80s with the awareness that everything she put on the page would be read against the full weight of Margaret's reputation, made choices about what to say and how to say it that are their own form of management. But she said enough. She said that Margaret was worth knowing, that the private person was genuinely worth the knowing, and that the public account of her life had, by the time of the memoir's publication in 2019, obscured that person under so many layers of managed narrative that the actual woman was at risk of disappearing beneath them. The memoir was an attempt at retrieval. It retrieved what it could. What it could not retrieve was the correspondence, the letters, the specific texture of those private hours in Kensington Palace and Mustique and Clarence House, and the back of the car on the way to the theatre, and the evenings that ran past midnight. Those are gone. They are in the archive, or in private estates, or destroyed. And the management that produced the gone is the same management this account has been tracing from June 1953 onward. The television drama The Crown, which ran on Netflix from 2016 to 2023, and which dedicated substantial material across several series to Princess Margaret's life and relationships, is worth addressing directly because it has, in the absence of the actual documents, become the primary source through which most people in the world now understand Margaret's story. The Crown is a dramatic work, not a historical document. Its creators and its network have said so, consistently and clearly. The conversations it depicts, the emotional interior lives it attributes to its characters, the specific dramatic moments it constructs from the general shape of historical events. These are inventions. They are informed inventions, produced from historical research and with historical consultants, but they are inventions. What is interesting about the Crown's version of Margaret is not whether it is accurate, but what it tells us about the shape of what is available to dramatize. Because the Crown, working from the historical record that exists, arrived at something that the record actually supports, a woman of considerable gifts, who was managed by an institution that did not know what to do with her, and who navigated that management across 70 years with varying degrees of success and dignity. The drama's Margaret, in the performances of Vanessa Kirby and Helena Bonham Carter across the series' multiple timeframes, is recognizable as a version of the woman described in Glenn Connor's memoir and in the better biographies. She is brilliant and difficult and funny, and sometimes cruel, and sometimes desperately kind, and consistently aware, in a way that is both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability, of exactly what is happening to her and exactly what she cannot change about it. The drama also reflects, in its structure and its choices, the same absence that this account has been tracking, the absence of the men's perspective. Townsend in The Crown is sympathetic but fundamentally exterior to the story, someone who happens to Margaret rather than someone who has his own equally full account of what passed between them. The drama can't show us what it doesn't have, and what it doesn't have is those letters. The letters would change the Crown's version of Margaret if they were available. They would change it not because they would make her more sympathetic or less sympathetic, but because they would make her more specific. Specific is what the management has prevented. Specific is what the archive controls. The drama works, as drama, within the general outline. The specific details, the ones that would transform the general outline into something irreducible to a character type, are not there. This is what the palace bought, not the preservation of a perfect reputation. Margaret's reputation has not been preserved as perfect. The biographies and the drama and the press coverage across 70 years have ensured that the cruelties and the difficulties and the complications are all on the record. What the palace preserved was the general outline at the expense of the specific. And the specific in a person's life is where the actual person lives. The actual person, in Margaret's case, lived in the conversations after midnight, in the correspondence with men who saw her without the performance, in the hours on a beach in Mustique where nobody required her to be Princess Margaret. The management ensured that those hours, for the most part, are not in the archive. The archive holds the managed version. The managed version is what we have. We are working, always, from the outline. the actual person recedes. At some point in the mid-1980s, when Margaret was in her mid-50s and the Llewellyn relationship had settled into friendship, and the Armstrong-Jones divorce was 7 years behind her, and the Douglas home death was 17 years behind her, and the Townsend statement was 30 years behind her, she told Anne Glenconner, something that Glenconner reproduces in Lady-in-Waiting, with the careful framing of someone who knows the sentence will travel further than the book. She said, "I'm not as nice as people think I am." Glenconner presents this as an act of self-awareness, which it was. It is also an act of self-definition, the kind of sentence that a person says when they want to establish, against the hagiographic version that a warm public is sometimes constructing around them, the accurate version. She was not as nice as people thought she was. She was also not as impossible as the staff memoir suggested, or as reckless as the press coverage implied, or as defeated as the sympathetic biographies framed her. She was a specific person with specific qualities, some admirable and some not, and the managed life she had lived had produced a version of her that was legible to the public, but not quite the real one. The sentence is also, and this is less often noticed, an act of protection. If she said it herself, no one else could use it to wound her. This is a habit of people who have spent decades managing what is said about them. They say the difficult truth first, and by saying it first, they control the framing of it in a way they cannot control the framing when someone else says it first. She was extraordinarily good at this. The self-deprecation was real, but it was also strategic, which is another way of saying it was characteristic. She had been watching the gap between what people said and what they meant since she was a child, doing impressions in the nursery at Glamis, and she had spent 70 years refining the understanding of that gap into a social instrument of considerable precision. The question of what she wanted, at the most fundamental level, beneath the performance and the management and the specific relationships with the specific men, is a question the record doesn't quite answer. It gestures toward an answer through the pattern of her choices, the men she chose who were not what the institution preferred, the moments when she pushed against the management rather than accepting it, the late nights and the piano and the running too long evenings that were not accidents or failures of self-control, but preferences, genuine preferences for a way of being that the formal structure of her public life could not contain. What she wanted, taken at this level of abstraction, was what the institution specifically could not give her. A life that was hers in the sense of being organized around what she was, rather than what she was supposed to be. The men she loved were people who had some access to the version of her that wasn't supposed to be, and the palace managed those people because it was managing, through them, that other version of her. The management worked, in the sense that the unmanaged version never fully escaped into the public record. The letters are not published. The diaries, if they exist, are not available. The conversations after midnight are in the memories of people who are themselves now mostly dead, or who made their own choices about what to carry into print. The management failed, in the sense that the outline is available, and the outline is enough to understand what was happening. The specific person is gone. The shape of the specific person remains. There is a moment in the archive that is available, and that has been noted by several biographers, that deserves to be named clearly. In the early 1970s, before the Llewellyn relationship began, and after the Armstrong-Jones marriage had settled into its Cold War phase, Margaret gave a speech at a dinner hosted by a charitable organization she patronized. The speech was not a state occasion. It was not a major public event. It was an after-dinner address to a room of people who supported a cause she had been formally associated with for years. The speech, in the accounts of people who were in the room, was extraordinary. She spoke without notes. She spoke about the cause with the specific knowledge of someone who had been paying attention for years, not performing interest but actually interested, and she made arguments that the professionals in the room said afterward they would not have been ashamed to make themselves. The anecdotes she used were particular and well chosen. The timing was the timing of someone who knows how to read an audience. The people in the room went home and told people about it. A few of them described it to journalists, and brief references appeared in print. The brief references were the standard thing. The princess was magnificent at the dinner. The brief references were all that appeared. There was no transcript, there was no recording, there was no longer account. She gave speeches like this throughout her life, in rooms that were not large enough or important enough to be recorded, to audiences who noticed what they were seeing but did not have the platform to say so in a way that would change the historical record. The speeches went into the people in the room, and the people carried them home, and in time the people died, and the speeches went with them. What remains is the outline, the form of a woman who was capable of real things that the institution arranged, so that the real things were always done in rooms too small for the record to reach. She was 71 when she died. The morning of February 9, 2002, was a Saturday. Outside the King Edward VII Hospital, London was doing what London does on a February Saturday morning, which is nothing connected to the specific life ending inside the building. The Queen was at Sandringham and was reached by telephone. The announcement came at noon. It was in the standard language. It said that Her Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, had died peacefully in her sleep. Peacefully is a standard word. It appears in most royal death announcements. Whether it is accurate, or whether it is, in this case, another sentence the palace uses, because the sentence was agreed upon long before the person it describes was born, is not something the record can tell us. What is in the record is what she had been. The most photographed woman in Britain for long stretches of 3 decades, the subject of thousands of newspaper columns, the focus of parliamentary debate, the inspiration for 2 characters in a drama that 100 million people watched. She had been, simultaneously, one of the most publicly discussed people in the country, and one of the least understood, because the discussion had been conducted with the managed outline and not the actual person. The men who might have given the other account, the account from inside the private hours, were gone before her, or had chosen their silence, or had it chosen for them. Townsend died in 1995. Douglas Home died in 1968. Armstrong-Jones outlived her by 15 years, and said, when he said anything, "What a man who has made a calculation about what is worth saying, tends to say." Llewellyn attended her funeral and went home. The account from inside the private hours is still waiting in the archive, or in private hands, or lost. What we have is the managed version, which is extensive, and the outline of the unmanaged version, which is enough to know it was there. It was there. The men who were silenced knew it. The women who were around her knew it, and the institution that spent 50 years managing them all knew it better than anyone, because it was what they were managing. Conclusion. The circle that closed. There is no tidy ending to this story. The circle that Margaret's secret relationships described is not one that closed on October 31, 1955, with a statement issued through the Press Association, or on May 24, 1978, with the finalization of a divorce, or on October 15, 1968, with an open verdict in a Berkshire inquest, or on February 15, 2002, when a quiet man arrived at Windsor for a funeral and then went home. The circle is still open. The letters are somewhere. The diaries, if they survived, are somewhere. The full accounting of what was paid and to whom, and what the payments purchased, is in the files of institutions that are not yet required to share them. What this account has tried to do is trace the outline. The outline is what the management made public by its actions: the exile, the titles, the settlements, the pressures, the managed silence across 50 years. Each instrument tells you something about what it was managing, the way a lock tells you something about what's behind the door. What was behind the door was a woman who deserved a fuller account than the institution allowed, and who, in the absence of that account, has been reduced in the public imagination to a series of tabloid frames: the tragic princess, the wasted talent, the beautiful ruin. None of those frames is entirely wrong. None of them is remotely sufficient. Peter Townsend, who was the closest to her for the shortest period of the actual peak of her youth, said in 1978 that she was the most wonderful woman he had ever known. He said it 23 years after the statement. He said it in an interview promoting a memoir that was careful not to say everything he knew. The sentence is the sentence of a man who has maintained his discretion, but who is not willing to maintain the pretense, at the price of the memoir's honesty, that what they had was not what it was. It was what it was. The management did not change that. The silence did not change that. The exile and the title and the settlement and the £36,000 debt and the sleeping pills and the 40 years of private garden design did not change that. What the management changed was what we know about it. That is the account, as completely as it can be assembled from what the management has permitted to exist. If you've watched this far, you have now seen this story assembled in a way it has not been assembled before. From the June 1953 exile of Peter Townsend to the February 2002 funeral at Windsor, where Roddy Llewellyn arrived and went home without speaking. If you found this account worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Everything we produce here is built the same way this was built, from primary sources, from the documents that have been released, from the accounts of people who were present, and from the honest acknowledgement of what we do not know and why we do not know it. The next video in this series covers the specific constitutional crisis of 1955 in full, including documents from the National Archives that have not been discussed on YouTube before, and what Anthony Eden's private correspondence says about the decision that ended the Townsend relationship. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll see you there. The island of Mustique still exists. Colin Tennant died in August 2010, in St. Lucia, in the manner he would have chosen, dramatically, in appropriate circumstances, with an audience. At the age of 83, Anne Glenconner was with him. The island he built from a private obsession into a private retreat was sold, piece by piece, over the decades following his development of it, to people who could pay for the specific combination of privacy and tropical beauty that he had found there in 1958. Les Jolies Eaux, the villa built to Oliver Messel's design, was sold by Margaret's estate after her death. It is now a rental property. Guests who book it can stay in the rooms where she spent her winters, on the hillside above Jellicoe Bay, with a view of the water that she watched for 30 years, and on a beach where a photograph was taken that changed the management's calculations and the public's understanding of what was happening, and, probably, the remainder of her life. The water looks the same, the beach looks the same. The story that happened there is in the archive, or in private hands, or in the memories of people who are still keeping it. Peter Townsend's house in Normandy passed to his wife and children. His medals are in various collections. The manuscript of Time and Chance is, presumably, somewhere in the holdings of its publishers or its estate. The correspondence with Margaret is somewhere he or his family put it. Antony Armstrong-Jones, the Earl of Snowdon, died on January 13, 2017, in London, at the age of 86. He did not publish a memoir. He left photographs. Robin Douglas Holmes' piano, if it was kept, is somewhere in an estate that has not been publicly catalogued. His letters from Margaret, or what remains of them, are somewhere the record cannot currently confirm. Roddy Llewellyn is in his late 70s, in England, tending something. Princess Margaret is in the Memorial Chapel of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in the vault that was opened for the interment of the King and Queen Mother before her. She was interred there in April 2002, in a ceremony that was private. There was no public footage. This, in the end, is the palace's most complete management, the actual body of the person, in a vault in a castle, at a ceremony nobody filmed. The woman who was the most photographed person in Britain for 30 years was buried without photographs. The archive holds what remains. The rest is still waiting. The marriage between Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones was, at its beginning, a genuine surprise. Not to the people who introduced them, or who had watched them circulate in the same social world for the preceding 2 years. To the country. The press had been tracking Margaret's post-Townsend years with the specific attention that attaches to a woman of her profile who has not yet done what society expects her to do. And the list of possible candidates that appeared in newspapers and in the society pages of magazines was a long list of appropriate men. Appropriate in the sense that the palace's management of these things had come to define appropriate. Heirs, officers, men with names and land and positions in the established order. Armstrong-Jones had a studio in Pimlico and a club foot and a manner that came from art schools and theatre people rather than from the institution. He was exactly what the careful management of the previous 7 years had been designed to prevent. The engagement announcement in February 1960 was a genuine disruption. The press did not know what to do with him at first, which is itself an unusual position for the British press in a royal story. They knew Townsend, officer, hero, tragic figure. They knew the template for a princess's romance. Armstrong-Jones did not fit the template, and the scramble to understand him, to research him, to find the right category, produced coverage that was simultaneously more confused and more interesting than the usual royal narrative. The wedding on May 6, 1960, was watched by an estimated 300 million people via the new medium of television. The numbers were not known with precision in 1960, but the estimates were large enough to establish that the wedding of a princess to a photographer was, in itself, a historical event, and that the historical event was being made possible by a technology that had not existed when Margaret was born. This detail is not trivial. Armstrong-Jones was a photographer. He understood image in a way that was native, not ceremonial. He understood that the television camera required a different kind of performance than the still camera, and that the crowd outside Westminster Abbey required a different kind of presence than the drawing room at Kensington Palace. He understood, in other words, the specific mechanics of the spectacle that Margaret had been part of since birth, and he understood them from the technical side, from behind the lens, which gave him a relationship to the spectacle that was, from Margaret's point of view, something genuinely new. She had never been with someone who understood the performance from the other side. Everyone in her life until Armstrong-Jones had been inside the performance with her, managing their own version of it while she managed hers. He came from outside. He had spent a decade photographing other people's performances, with a technical precision that was also a kind of analytical distance. Whether this made him, in the event, a better or worse partner for someone who desperately wanted an escape from the performance, is something the 18 years of the marriage answered with sufficient clarity. Better at the beginning, worse at the end. The analytical distance that made him fascinating became, across the years, the specific instrument of a coldness that the people around them described consistently as deliberate. He used what he knew about her to say the precise thing that would cause the most specific damage at the most specific moment. She used what she knew about him in return. By the late 1960s, the marriage had become a competition in which both parties had lost interest in winning, but neither had yet found a way to stop playing. The apartment at Kensington Palace 1A was the stage for this. 20 rooms in a palace, which sounds large until you understand that the 20 rooms also contained a household of staff, and the children, and the public rooms used for formal entertaining, and the private rooms that were genuinely private only when everyone else had left. Margaret's apartment at Kensington Palace was, in its daily operation, not a private home. It was a managed environment. Armstrong-Jones, who had come from a studio in Pimlico where the management was entirely his own, found this difficult in ways that he never publicly acknowledged, but that several people in the household described over the years. The notes he kept in a drawer, the written insults that multiple biographers describe, are the behavior of a man who has identified the difference between the argument he is allowed to have in a managed environment and the argument he would like to have, and has found a way to have the private version at the moments when the private version is most effective. It is a specific kind of cruelty that requires intelligence and patience to sustain. He had both. She responded, not in kind, because the specific form of his cruelty was not available to her in the same way, but in the ways that were available. The dismissals, the public humiliations in company, the behavior that the household described as tempestuous, and that was, on the evidence of multiple accounts, often genuinely beyond her management, in moments when the accumulated weight of the marriage pressed past her capacity to absorb it. The children were in the apartment during this. David was born in 1961, Sarah in 1964. By the time Sarah was 3 years old, the marriage was already in its difficult phase. By the time David was 7, the household was managing a cold war between two people whose mutual intelligence made the war colder than it might otherwise have been. The children grew up with it, as children do when a marriage is this kind of marriage. They absorbed it as the background condition of the household, the specific atmosphere that a certain kind of adult relationship creates around itself, and they each responded to the absorption differently. David became the Earl of Snowdon after his father's death, and built a furniture company in Pimlico, and a life that was, by most available accounts, largely functional. Sarah became a painter, and refused most of what the royal world offered her, and lives in Surrey. The two responses are the two versions of what children of this particular household could make of what they inherited, the version that stays inside the world, renovating it, and the version that leaves. The marriage's public phase, from the 1960 wedding to the 1976 separation announcement, was one of the most photographed marriages in Britain. Armstrong-Jones did not photograph it himself, or not often. The records of his professional work from this period show a man working extensively across a range of subjects, and largely not using his wife as one of them. The photographs that exist of their public life together were taken by other photographers, which means they show what two people look like when they are performing their public roles, not what a photographer sees when he looks at someone he knows. The photographs are mostly pleasant. That is what the performance was designed to produce. The last time they appeared together in public as a married couple, in the months before the March 1976 separation announcement, was a period in which the performance had become something neither of them could maintain with the required conviction. People who attended events with them in 1975 and early 1976 describe a couple who were present but not together. Two people moving through the same social world in parallel trajectories that only intersected when the camera required them to. The camera required them to less often than it once had. By the mid-1970s, the most dramatic coverage of the royal family's social life was shifting toward the younger generation, Charles and his various companions, Anne and her marriage to Mark Phillips. Margaret was 45 and a figure who had been public for 35 years, and the press coverage of her had settled into the register of ongoing observation rather than the register of surprise. The Sunday People photograph disrupted this. It was surprising in a way that the management had, until that February morning, prevented the coverage of Margaret from being for several years. The surprise was part of its impact, not just the relationship it revealed, but the revelation that the management had been operating around something that had been happening for 3 years without public knowledge. The palace's response, across the 3 weeks between February 22 and the mid-March separation announcement, was to manage the transition from one public narrative to another. The narrative of the working royal marriage, which had been the official story since 1960, had been undercut by a photograph from a beach. The replacement narrative, the one the separation announcement began to establish, was the narrative of an amicable separation between two creative people whose lives had taken different directions. The amicable narrative was not entirely accurate, but it was adequate. It moved the story from the register of scandal to the register of dignified adult decision-making, which is exactly where the palace preferred it. The divorce finalized in May 1978 was, from the palace's management perspective, a clean conclusion to a public situation that had required management for the previous 2 years. Armstrong-Jones received his settlement, retained his title, and maintained the social world. Margaret received continued residence at Kensington Palace 1A, continued civil list funding at a revised rate following the parliamentary debate that the Willie Hamilton intervention had made unavoidable, and the formal end of a marriage that had been effectively over for the better part of a decade. What she did not receive, and could not receive from a settlement or a management arrangement or an amicable divorce narrative, was the 2 decades between 1955 and 1975 in which she had been inside this marriage, rather than the one she had been refused. The costs of those 2 decades were not financeable. They were carried in the woman who emerged from the divorce at 47 years old, who was still brilliant and still funny and still capable of holding a room, and who had used up something in the holding of a room for 20 years of the wrong marriage that she did not have infinite supplies of. The Roddy Llewellyn years were the afterlife of those 2 decades. The warmth was real. The laughter was genuine. What was also real, by the accounts of people who were around her during this period, was the tiredness underneath the warmth, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been managing too many things for too long, and who has finally found somewhere where management is not required, and who knows, at 43, and at 47, and at 50, that the somewhere is temporary, and that the management will return when it ends. The management returned. The photograph made sure of it, and after the photograph, there was nothing left to manage except the health, and the health eventually managed itself. Robin Douglas Home played piano at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London's Soho before it became a legend of the British jazz scene. The club opened in October 1959 on Gerrard Street, before its later move to Frith Street. Douglas Home was one of the musicians who appeared in its early years, a pianist with the specific capability of someone who has been playing seriously since childhood and who has developed, alongside the technical ability, the social fluency that jazz performance in a small London club requires. Jazz piano in this period, and this milieu, was not background music, it was foreground, and the quality of the player was audible to everyone in the room who was paying attention. The people who heard Douglas Home at Ronnie Scott's, and at similar venues in London, in the early 1960s, describe a player who was better than the situation required, someone whose facility with the standard repertoire went beyond proficiency into the territory where a musician is listening to the music as they play it, and making decisions about where it should go, that are not decisions a merely competent player makes. Margaret played piano to a comparable standard. The accounts of her ability are consistent across sources, well above competent, approaching serious, the standard of someone who has practiced daily for most of their life. The repertoire she played at the dinners after midnight that ran too long was the American Songbook, Cole Porter and Rodgers and Hart and the Gershwins, and the accounts of people who heard her play it describe a woman who not only knew the songs, but knew why they worked, the specific thing that each one was doing harmonically and melodically that made it a song rather than a sequence of chords. Two people at this level of musical engagement in the same social world, in 1967, will find each other's company specific in a way that people who share a professional field understand, and that is difficult to describe from outside. They were not performing for each other. They were talking in a language that was genuinely their own, at a level of specificity that the surrounding conversations, however intelligent, could not reach. This is the dimension of the Douglas Home relationship that the management afterward reduced to a problem to be handled. The letters he had were a problem. The approach to Neue Review was a problem. The debts were, in a specific sense, a leverage point. The piano was not a leverage point, and was not a problem, and has not, in the accounts of the situation, been given the weight it deserves. What Margaret found in Robin Douglas Home was not only the connection that the letters reflect. It was, partly, a conversation about music at the level where music is actually discussed between people who understand it. She had been having that conversation at a certain depth with Noel Coward for years, and Coward was one of the people she was genuinely close to. But Coward was 20 years older, and was a figure of such formidable achievement in his own right, that the conversation was always slightly asymmetric. Douglas Home was the same age, from the same social milieu, and was present without being formidable. He was there, in the piano years of the late 1960s, in the way that people who share a specific capability in a shared language are there for each other, and when he was gone, at 36, in a flat in Berkshire in October 1968, the conversation ended. The palace did not kill Robin Douglas Home. That much needs to be clear. He made his own choices, and the choices he made in the last years of his life were his choices, made from inside his own desperation, and his own judgment, and his own emotional resources, which had, by October 1968, been pressed further than they could sustain. But the palace did not make the conditions of his life easier, and the specific thing he attempted, the conversion of what he knew into the relief of what he owed, was met by a world that told him the conversion was not available. A man who is told that the one resource he has is not convertible, at the moment when he needs conversion most, is in a specific position. The position has a name, and the name is not available in polite institutional language, but it is recognizable to everyone who has been in a version of it, and the recognition is why the story of Robin Douglas Home has a quality in the telling that the stories of the other three men do not quite have. He was not managed into silence. He was simply left without options, and the options he had tried to make ended at an inquest with an open verdict in a county where a man of 36 had taken sleeping pills in a flat and not woken up. The piano at Les Jolis Eaux, in Mustique, was played by Margaret, by various guests, by anyone who knew how, on the evenings that ran past midnight under the Caribbean sky. Whether she played the songs she and Douglas Home had discussed, or whether she played something entirely different, or whether the piano at Mustique was a different relationship entirely, free of the associations that it would have carried in London, is not something any source answers. The question is the shape of the absence. What is in the absence is what the management left out.